Welcome, everyone. This is Mike Gibbs, and we are here for day 2 of our Enterprise Architecture Fundamentals Bootcamp, where we're going over things what real enterprise architects do in their job. So this should be a fun day. We've got a couple of hours of discussions, and we also have a bit of lab too. So to tell everybody what we're going to talk about today and what we're going to do today is we're going to begin and talk about reference architectures versus solutions architectures. The purpose and point of a reference architecture. We'll go over various examples of reference architectures. We'll talk about the difference between a reference architecture and a solutions architecture and when you would need both. We'll talk about, from an enterprise architecture perspective, when you should standardize on an architecture and when you shouldn't. And then we'll talk about all the things that go into that. Now, after that, we're going to have some fun in enterprise architecture frameworks because everybody's curious about frameworks. And we're going to talk about why enterprise architecture frameworks exist and the real problems that exist with enterprise architecture frameworks if you use them incorrectly. And then we're going to talk about how to use an enterprise architecture framework together properly. And we're even going to recommend the main type of architectural artifacts you can create without turning into a documentation factory. And then we're going to talk about TOGAF. You know, everybody is always interested in learning the TOGAF architectural development method. We're going to discuss TOGAF 10, and we'll talk about what TOGAF is from an introductory level. We'll walk through the phases of the TOGAF architecture. And then after that, we're going to spend about an hour and a half or 2 hours on the live TOGAF lab. What we're going to do is we'll work on an organization. It's going to be a healthcare organization, and we're going to create the enterprise architecture for that healthcare organization. I know you always see me create architectures related to healthcare, and let's be fair, in the last 26 years as an enterprise architect, I've consulted to everybody, banks, internet service providers, but most of my time as a chief architect was as a healthcare enterprise architect. So that's where my go-to place is. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, before we begin, I want to tell you about a couple of 3 things we have going on to assist you in your architecture career. Tomorrow, and every Monday and Thursday for that matter, we run a completely free architecture webinar where we talk about how to become an architect. Tomorrow's webinar is how to become a security architect, but we'll discuss any other architecture careers you desire there as well. We'll talk about what we do in various architecture roles, the skills that you actually need, how to get hired and stand out when you lack experience or even do have experience, and everything it takes to get hired. And these free webinars are live on Zoom. So my team will drop a link to the free architecture webinars in the description of this video, as well as in that chat box. Now, we also have a book that's coming out at the end of this enterprise architecture program. The book is written by me. It is written by my good friend Jasser, who is a phenomenal enterprise architect. And that's going to be based on all of what we've covered in these weeks. It's going to have documents, illustrations. It's really going to help you with enterprise architecture. So sign up for it now. And in the end, when this course is over, we will email it to you. And that's really what I want to tell you about today. And always check the description of our videos because there's guides on winning the interview, like an enterprise architect interview. There's guides on how to become a cloud architect, AI architect, and other architects. So check out some of the free things. I hope it helps you so much with your enterprise architect career. So we're going to begin in about a minute. And then, like I said, we'll go over these things we talked about, and then we'll have fun. We're going to work through an entire architecture from the beginning, that preliminary phase, all the way to the end in governance. So hope it's a lot of fun for you. Strap in. Now, I want to know you're awake, that you're here, you're excited to be here. So if you give me a hashtag enterprise architect, please do so. And as we go through this, if you have questions, ask them. We want to do anything we can to help you in your enterprise architect career. So if you're confused about something, just drop it in the chat box and we will get through it. What we'll do is we'll talk for a little while, then answer some questions. So put any questions you have here, anything we can do to help you in your architecture career. So that's where I'm at. It looks like I see some enterprise architects coming in. And also tell me where you're from. I'm over here in South Florida. It is hot as can be today. It was about 36 degrees centigrade outside, about 96, 97 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm doing the math in my head, but it was nice and hot. My cat walked out, took a few steps, saw how hot it was, walked right back in the house. Love seeing some of these things for enterprise architect. And yes, this is very much so live. I pre-recorded a few of the things, and I'll tell you when we launch the pre-recorded things. But yes, this is very, very much live. So please bring in your questions. Jasser. It's always good to see Jasser. That's Jasser. He's a phenomenal enterprise architect. And he's the co-author of my book. Darnell, so good to see you. Enterprise architect. I love that. Adrian over there in Phoenix. And yes, it's very hot in Phoenix too. I've spent a lot of time over there. NAD in Houston, Texas. Love that. Ahmad, so good to see you. Enterprise architect in the UK. This is great. Let's begin with the content, and we'll see you in a short period of time to answer some questions. Now we're going to continue our discussion of enterprise architecture, but we're going to be discussing reference architectures versus solutions architectures. And that's going to be the discussion we're going to have here. Now, in many cases, organizations keep reinventing the wheel. They have a project, they design something, they have another project, they design something when there was already a approved design there in the form of a reference architecture, or at least as a starting point. So today we're going to talk about what that actually is and why do reference architectures actually exist. So reference architectures are there to make sure that in every single product, we don't keep coming up with a new way to do it, because that takes us into all kinds of complexities, costs, and challenges later on. So we're looking for ways to prevent that, to accelerate the team's delivery of new products and services while reducing the risk of something going wrong along the way. So we're going to discuss the difference today between reference architectures and solutions designs. Both what are they and why people confuse the two, but they're not the same. We'll talk about when to standardize on an architecture, because there are many times things should be standardized around a reference architecture, but yet not always. And we're also going to talk a little bit about how to communicate and drive adoption, because a reference architecture that nobody uses, well, is just a picture that's doing nothing. So we're going to focus on those issues. So the key here to remember is we have to be able to understand as architects the difference between enterprise guidance versus specific project design and set those expectations fairly clearly. So let's first talk about a reference architecture. The goal of a reference architecture is to make something simple and repeatable. It's a repeatable pattern for a type of problem. So by doing so, maybe we have an event-driven type of architecture for various workloads, and we've got a standard pattern to do that as a starting point. Maybe we've got a pattern for analytics on cloud. Maybe we have a reference architecture for managing our APIs, for example, or a reference architecture for our IAM strategies, or even a reference architecture on what does a secure landing zone look like in a cloud provider. And that's a pattern. And it's a pattern that could be reused again and again and again. And that's what we're typically talking here. So key building blocks and how they interact, how data might flow. These are the types of things that we're capturing in these reference architectures. Non-functional requirements along the way we're capturing and making sure they're part of it. And that's really what we're doing. We're coming up with an exceptional, like a logical perspective to look at it. So for example, let's say we had a wide area network reference architecture that covers 2 cities. What you see is a router on both sides of them, and the router might have a primary link and the router might have a backup link. Now, what don't you see? You don't see what brand of router it is. You don't see who the wide area network links are, or even which ports are used. And that's intentional because this is a reference architecture pattern. Because this could be used for every critical office's remote wide area network environment. So that's something we're typically talking about at that reference architecture level. But that is not a solutions architecture. A solutions architecture dives deeper. So we start with a reference architecture of what our patterns are, and then we figure out exactly what we're going to use when we come to the solutions architecture. And I'll show you what I mean by that now in a minute. So a solutions architecture is different. It's going to list the concrete services, the configurations of what we actually have, how we sized it. For example, what size virtual machine we use, how many cores, how much DRAM, even the model number of a virtual machine, for example. Detailed interfaces and contracts
project-specific complaints and run books and etc. So let's take this out and build it out a little bit. So if we go back to this as a reference architecture, note you've got two routers. Now, if we were to start to create that solutions architecture, and I'm going to add a few more details already, but look, now we've got the model numbers, we have the links of who these are, and if we really wanted to get a little deeper, we could even say on this router that this is GE or 10 gig E or whatever they call it, and we could say that it's module 0/1. And then on the module between it, because what we're doing here in the solutions architecture is we're getting very specific on what's being connected and to where. And obviously you would have this on both sides. Let's assume they're both the same models and use the same port on both sides to keep it simple. But that's where we get deeper into that solutions architecture. This is showing you where everything is, the exact model number of the Cisco switch, the providers of the links, and even the port numbers that you're plugged into that switch. So that's looking more at that solutions architecture. So if you look at reference architecture as a class of solutions for the business, and if you look at a solution design or a solutions architecture, it's this one thing that we're doing right now. So reference architectures are architecture patterns. That wide area network reference architecture pattern, I could have showed you that in 1996, and I could show you this in 2025, and it's still equally relevant. Now, why is that? Well, because it's a reference pattern of what to do for a wide area network. And usually a reference architecture can live for years and be reused many, many times. But not so much for a solutions architecture. That's going to be with a specific product or a specific workload. Because if you look at this, and here's why I'm going to go back to these two, it didn't matter what router we're talking about here in that reference architecture. We need a router on both sides of a wide area network. Done. But when we got here, we said this 6.8512x, the Catalyst switch router. But, will we be using this 10 years from now? Probably not. We'll be using something different. And will those 10 gig links be enough in 10 gigs years from now? Who knows? Maybe we need 100 gig links. We'll see what happens over time. But that's why we're dealing with the differences in getting there. So I hope that makes sense. So if we look at it this way, a reference architecture is for architects. It's for tech leads. It's even for senior design engineers. The people that are going to be making the decisions settings, the decisions, that's who the reference architectures are for. Now, the solution design, that's going to be more for the delivery team, the operational team, the vendors, and the people that are actually running the actual thing. So it's a different set of skills between that solution architecture world and that actual enterprise architecture world. So if you look at it, you can look at that reference architecture, for example, as a city blueprint. How would you design any big city? And then you could actually look at a building blueprint and consider that to be more of the solutions architecture. So big picture, entire city, reference architecture. Individual buildings and their blueprints is one way to look at it. Another way I like to look at it is the difference between a cookbook and a meal. A reference architecture is really like a recipe pattern. For example, it's going to list the main types of ingredients, the method, and you might cook something. Now, the solution architecture would be exactly what you cook tonight. Okay, tonight I'm going to make a Greek salad, and in that I'm going to cut my cucumbers. I'm going to and I'm going to tell you how many cucumbers. Then I'm going to tell you how many onions I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to tell you how many tomatoes I'm going to cut. Then I'm going to tell you exactly how much olive oil and feta cheese to put in there. And oregano, and that is more that solutions architecture, that actual recipe for the one thing. So, quick question for you, and I hope it's very obvious. If you see a diagram with the number of actual virtual machines and the size of the subnet and the exact service names, what kind of architecture is that? Let me know in the chat box or the comments section. If you answered that as solutions architecture, great. So the next question that we need to think of is, when should we standardize a reference architecture versus when do we just let our teams design things freely? And that's something really important to talk about. So we want to standardize when it matters, But we don't want to over-standardize everything because that'll get us in trouble too. So the first principle to think of regarding standardization of architectures is not everything deserves a reference architecture. Standardization is an investment, and we should use it when the return is high. So the things that I want you to think of, typically speaking, when you would use a reference architecture are typically three triggers. Reuse, like we can reuse it again, risk reduction, and cost. So there's some patterns that you just typically use again and again and again. I've got a fairly specific pattern I would use for, say, a demilitarized zone for an organization. There's this fairly specific pattern you could create an API and not what that would look like. You can come up with some fairly reference patterns of data integrations or identity and access management across the enterprise, or even some types of logging or monitoring things, or even messaging types of things that go on inside of an organization, or even a CI/CD pipeline. And a lot of common business capabilities, this is what we're looking at. Things like payments or customer identity or order management, things that show up every day. These things are great for standardization because it'll help us because we're going to reuse it, we're going to reuse it, or reuse it. Now, if we've got something that is high risk, and the risk of a breach is rough, this is a security sensitive area where we need a lot of identity, a lot of data protection, regulated flows. So we're in this kind of mission critical environment, we typically want to use or create some kind of reference architecture to standardize this because we don't want anybody doing it in a manner that's going to break it. Now let's also talk about high costs. If we're dealing with an architecture pattern or an for the infrastructure or whatever, and mistakes are extremely costly to fix later, expensive to fix later, well, then it's worth it to plan right now a great reference architecture pattern that's reusable so we don't make mistakes which are expensive to fix later. So standardization does give you some great things. If you standardize the right things, not everything, but the right things, you get a faster project start because teams start from a known pattern. You make less mistakes, which is great for decisions. It's a lot easier governance. Reviews come, which architecture pattern did you use, not explain your whole work view. Now, the problem is what happens if we overly standardize. Well, we crushed innovation because everything follows a standard model. If we make it, there's only one way to do things, well, what happens when the things don't actually fit the only one way? If we try to over-standardize everything, well, that'll just turn into endless debates. So, and the business will start hearing about over-standardization and not innovating, and that will be problems too, because people will say things like architecture will slow them down. So, here's a practical rule of thumb to think about. Standardize what you want to optimize and scale. The big stuff that you're going to use all the time, but leave room for experimentation at the edges. Because if you want innovation, you can't standardize everything. You need to be able to experiment. But you do want to standardize repeatable foundations that experiments can run on. So certain patterns, yes, we standardize, certain patterns we don't. And that's going to be absolutely critical. Let's talk about how as enterprise architects, we need to communicate for people to be willing to adopt our architectures. So if we have a goal of making a reference architecture consumable, we have to find the right level of detail in what we document. Because a reference architecture is only going to be valuable if teams adopt it. And teams adopt typically things that are clear, that are usable, that are easy to find. So make sure you make your reference architecture consumable. Use a simple primary view in plain language. Start with the primary view and don't bog people down into a death by diagrams where you give them so many diagrams they can't find anything. So we put a clear purpose statement on use this when you need this. Okay, use this architecture when you need a high availability WAN. And label the building blocks in plain language. Tool names can be secondary. So if you think about this, when we went back to that link that I showed you earlier, I called it a router because I know that I need a router to create a wide area network like this. Now, I didn't call it the exact model number because that's the difference between that reference architecture and that solutions architecture. But we communicated it in very plain language. Look, it's a router. So if you're going to want to be able to sell your architectures and get your architectures adopted so you can create value as an enterprise architect, your architectures, realistically speaking, must be able to answer the following 3 questions. The first question is, when do I use this thing? So give scenarios and examples and criteria, and tell the teams what the reference architecture is and where it should be used and where it shouldn't. Now, the next question that your reference architecture has to deal with is, what do I have to do? So it should have some kind of implementation guidance, some kind of constraints, some kind of should rules. You should have this. And we need to focus on what teams must not guess. And that's typically things related to security, data handling, observability, or integration. So when we think about our architectures being used, the first one is, how do people use it? The second one is, what do they have to do? And then the third one regarding your reference architecture is, what flexibility do you have? Do you allow variance of your reference architecture? Because to be a great starting point, it might need to be tuned. Do you allow extension points? And choices that are permitted within the pattern are usually valuable, and people tend to use them. If it's too rigid, teams typically don't use them. So that's something we need to think about. And we also need to think about, where do we publish our reference architectures, how we embed them in delivery. So in one perspective, we have to make reference architectures easy to find in a common environment, potentially an architecture repository. But whatever we need to do, we need to create a portal, a wiki, a catalog, something, because these things have to be easy to find. If you can't find the recipe to your omelet, you're just going to cook it any way you want. So that's really what we're talking about. So let's talk about how we embed reference architectures in the way we work. Ultimately, in many cases, we will have to create what's called an architectural review board. And in the architectural review board, we'll have people from a wide variety of environments: networking, security, the various components of the business, AI, everybody. And that way, when someone wants to make a change, the entire team can look at it and assess the impact to the entire system. Is it a good change? When could the change be made? What have you? So if we put our architectural review boards and reference architecture patterns there, that will help. And that way the architectural review board can say, well, which reference architecture pattern did you use? Now, if we've got a project kickoff, that's a great place to start with a reference architecture pattern. No, we're going to provide some thought leadership or do some tech talks. Generally speaking, that is some form of reference architecture, because when we're talking as advisors, and an enterprise architect is a strategist or advisor, and we're at a conference, it's not about somebody's product. It's about being a trusted advisor and being able to make that business better. So I like to treat a reference architecture just like a product. We create them. We get feedback from the teams, and we make them, and we evolve them to be what the company needs to speed things along without locking them down. So here's kind of the way I would look at a reference architecture to kind of assess its quality. If nobody needs exceptions, your architecture is probably too vague. If everybody needs an exception to do it their way, your architecture is probably too rigid. So what we want to do is think about it from that perspective. So let's talk about detail level questioning. And let's hit the big question that always comes up for enterprise architects. What's enough detail to be useful? And the way I would describe it is, you're going to need enough detail in any architecture pattern you create that teams don't guess its importance, but not so much that they feel like they're just filling out a template. So a practical way to decide if enough detail is part of your reference architecture is to look at the following. A good reference architecture will have mandatory controls like security and compliance. A good reference architecture will typically have some required integration patterns, some required observability, some required data handling and trust boundaries, and something that would be a standing building block or a start of what you're going to work with. Now, a great reference architecture will not have the exact sizing because it's not a reference architecture, that's a solutions architecture. It will not have any interface, every interface and everything that's used and every card on a router or a switch. That's not a reference architecture, that's more of a solutions architecture. A reference architecture will not have every vendor SKU unless your organization is intentionally trying to standardize on a certain vendor's product. Because the moment your reference architecture becomes too specific, your reference architecture becomes no longer usable. It turns into a solution design wearing a reference architecture label, and nobody wants that.
All right, welcome back. So we're back. We're here to take any questions. Like I said, I had pre-recorded some of today's content, but of course, the architectural work we're going to do is going to be live. And of course, I want to answer your questions live. So let's see if anyone had any questions in the last few minutes. While we wait for questions, if you're having a good time, give the video a like. If you're not a subscriber, well, maybe subscribe if you want to build an enterprise architect, a security architect, an AI architect, or a cloud architect career. And hit the bell to be notified of new videos. But let's see if there was any questions that anyone had along the way. Milan, that would be a fun place to go to right now. Oh, so good to see all these enterprise architects. And I love we've got Berlin, Delaware, or Berlin, Germany, I was assuming. But it could be Delaware too. I think there is a Berlin, New Jersey. There might be a Berlin, Delaware too. Enterprise architecture by way of Thailand. Talk about a beautiful place. That would be a nice vacation right now. Suggest free architecture book links and blogs. So let me give you some guidance. So I have 2 videos that I will suggest for you. One is, they're on cloud architecture, but they'll both be kind of helpful to you. One is on the technical books that will help as an architect that cover some of the things like networking and data center and security and architectural design. And the other one is about business. And Chris from my team will drop a playlist link inside of the chat box. Now, I want you to understand what we're doing as enterprise architects, if that's what you're interested in, since we're talking about enterprise architecture. We're providing strategy and guidance to the C-suite, which means much of our work is guiding some of the world's best business leaders on how to improve their businesses. So you're not going to be able to go to a blog. When you want to actually read architectural things, in order to be able to advise the CEOs, you're going to have to know what they know about business and be able to communicate at that level. So, for example, one thing that a great enterprise architect would read would be, for example, Business Week, Chief Information Officer magazine, Forbes magazine is more of what we would be, The Economist, because that's kind of shaping the way you're thinking exactly the same way the C-suite is. Books on finance, books on leadership, anything on executive presence, reading an audience psychology, presentation skills, that's really going to help you. But I'm going to invite you tomorrow to our How to Become a Security Architect webinar, and we'll cover what we do as architects. We'll cover the 4 pillars of architect skills that actually build architecture careers, which are executive skills, business skills, communication skills, and of course, tech skills. And then ask me any questions, because we can build you a better, bigger framework there. David, it's great to see you, enterprise architect. One of the most fun jobs I've ever had. Those reference architectures, are they specific to the industry? So, it's kind of interesting you mentioned that. So they can be. In fact, if you look out there on the internet, I might do a quick Google and see if I can find it while we're here. Cisco asked me to write a reference architecture for healthcare. And we called that a reference architecture the medical grade network. And what it did, it showed patterns of how you would design a network for healthcare organizations. So it was there. So yes, we often create very specific reference architectures to it for an industry. For example, how might a healthcare organization do it? How might this organization do it? But here's the other key to remember. We might have 2 hospitals, for example, that serve a different set of clients. One could be doing cutting edge cancer research and another one could be doing community care. And even for those two hospitals that are both in the medical business, they could have different business processes and different ways to do it, and they will both need different reference architectures. Likewise, we could have two banks. One is predominantly retail banking for the end user, and another one's an investment bank. And the processes and other things and the way they do their job are somewhat different. So yes, there are industry-specific architectures, and there are others that are not. So I actually did a quick Google, and I found this document that I wrote with my really good friend Howard when I was at Cisco on enterprise architecture. I'm not sure of this website, but I'm just going to drop the link that I found it on, but because it does look like this whole. Let me just verify that it's the architecture that I wrote, since I don't remember the link on the Cisco website. But here you go. Let me drop this into the chat box, and it'll give you an example of when we do industry type reference architectures, what they look like. And that's the one I just posted, where it says the medical grade network. That'll give you an example of an industry-specific reference architecture pattern. Great question. Who else has any kind of questions on this topic so far? Are there any other questions back there? What are the recommended certifications? So come to the how to become an architect, and we'll talk about certifications, but an architecture career is not built on certifications. An architecture career is based upon your ability to be able to walk into an organization, understand their business challenges, understand the way their business is architected or functioning as designed right now, be able to work with that organization, improve the way their business is going to operate in the future, then be able to create an architecture team, then be able to lead that architecture team to design whatever solution is going to be necessary for that client. And then at the same time, be able to present that back to the client, be able to align the client stakeholders, get them to actually fund your architecture, which in many cases will be $1 billion or more, and then getting them to agree whatever it's going to take to actually implement the architecture. So that's not really going to be on certifications. And that's why people come to me with 30, 40 certifications, and we have to basically train them to be an architect. Now, which certifications are going to help you get interviews as an enterprise architect? I can tell you that right now. TOGAF 10 is a big one, and that's why we provide that to our students after we teach them architecture to get them big interviews. The Azure Solutions Architect Expert will get you more interviews, as would the AWS Solutions Architect Professional, as would the Google Professional Cloud Architect. Now, they are all about implementation, have absolutely nothing to do with architecture, those certifications, but they will get you interviews. TOGAF's more of a framework step-by-step. We're going to walk through a TOGAF 10 framework example today, so you'll see exactly what that certification's about. And those two will get you lots and lots of interviews. But you have to learn how to be an architect first, and they're different than what's in the certification. So keep following this, keep enjoying what we're teaching you, keep seeing how we're designing architecture patterns out, and we'll be thrilled to help you along the way. And then come to our webinar tomorrow, and we can talk, and I'll give you the full list of every skill you need to know. You can ask me questions live also.
Mike, did you try to post the link to your white paper?
Yes.
Okay. Somehow your YouTube account is not a moderator on this channel, so the link did not come through. So I will post the white paper. I'm assuming it's the one that's
the https://img. whatever.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that
Somebody
one.
linked to the paper.
Yeah, I found that one too. Okay. And just so you know, I don't know if you keep up with it. I searched this a few months ago, and it actually it was referenced in some other publication about the modern healthcare network. To give you an idea how long ago you wrote that, and it's still referenced as the modern thing. So I'll put that in the chat box. I didn't want to just put it in there again in case something was going wrong. All right.
From Jasser. Can I talk about the trade-offs of getting your reference architecture from a managed service provider or a vendor? Absolutely. So this is really important. When a vendor creates a reference architecture like the AWS well-architected framework or the Azure well-architected framework, what those reference architectures are how would they recommend you use their stuff if that's all you ever used? So there's no difference in the AWS well-architected framework between how a hospital should use it, how a bank should use their gear, or how an auto manufacturer should use their gear. It's just here, everybody kind of do the same architecture patterns. Now, the reality is that's great on the technical guidance, but on the how do you get any reality in business growth, patient X and patient Y that have different medical conditions just don't get the same treatment. So that's the downside of the vendor. So when you look at a vendor reference architecture like an AWS well-architected framework, what I want you to see and appreciate and leverage is there's a lot of good technical guidance from the people that actually know their equipment best. And that's great. But the downside is they're trying to give everybody the same recipe, and that, generally speaking, doesn't work. So if you get something from a managed service provider, again, you could run into the same thing. If I have a managed service provider that only deals with 2 vendors, that managed service provider might create an architecture that's not in my best interest at all because it's the only thing they can sell. So the reality is enterprises will have their own sets of architects, and we will deal with vendor architects. And here's how it'll kind of work. And it's really great that you actually brought it up. So I determine from an enterprise perspective what we're going to build, why we're going to build it. Then my platform architects, like my cloud architects, security architects, kind of develop the cloud strategy. The application architects develop the application strategy, what have you. And then when it comes down to the solutions architecture, our platform architects and enterprise architects are calling in the vendor. Okay, I need 5,000 virtual machines. AWS, which ones do you recommend? Dell, I need 5,000 virtual machines. Can you give me a proposal for a server that'll meet these needs? And that's where we really get into that solutions architecture. So I like to bring in the vendors in the end. Once we know what the business needs, once we know what we do, that's when I start looking at vendor patterns. But the real key as an architect is not to start with what are we doing first. The key is to determine what should we build? Why should we build it? What do we need? Is this going to benefit the business? So that's the key. So a reference architecture, a tool, a vendor, a tool, a managed service provider, a tool. And the key to doing anything great is to know what tool to use for what job. Great question, Jasser. Thank you for asking that. I think you probably knew that would be clarification for a lot of people. So I appreciate the question. Vishal, is there any guidance to architect a cloud application with FinOps in mind? So let's kind of talk about the difference between an architect and an engineer. The architect first starts with what does the business need? And I'm not an application architect, but I am a cloud architect. I'm an enterprise architect, what have you. But the biggest thing is, what does that business need? Then when we start looking at that business, then we actually look at what is that business's capabilities? And then what are the capabilities that business needs? And then we determine if there's an application, should we build it? Should we buy it? And then after we determine where we should build it or where we should buy it, we have to learn the capabilities of our staff, what kind of staff we have, what kind of reuse of patterns that we have. For example, are we a developer-based culture where they reuse our various elements of code? Are we a business that needs a lot of stability and we don't want to make changes very quickly because we need pure accuracy like a nuclear power plant would be? Finish what that business actually needs to be. And only then can we start thinking about the application. And when we think about the application, the last thing I'm going to think about is FinOps. And here's the reason. Today, we're going to do an enterprise architecture. We're going to give you a walkthrough model. And I'm going to give you 2 models on how to host this. One model is going to cost $550,000 a month on the cloud. The other model is going to cost less than $500,000 one time. And the one that costs $5,000 one time has 300% growth already built right in. And it's still cheaper. So the first thing we need to also think is, which cloud should it go on? Should it go on the private cloud? Should we go on the public cloud? And only after we know what we need, and then we can figure out what the right application architecture is, and then we can even think about the right compute infrastructure, do we even start thinking about FinOps. So why has FinOps become a big thing? FinOps, if you've made a mistake and you've architected your system poorly, FinOps is like when you go to the ER and somebody's having chest pain and they take care of the heart attack. That's what FinOps is. Somebody made a mistake and they're cleaning it up. If you architect it correctly and you truly understand the business acumen and you've got the financial acumen to calculate the right cost, it'll cost you so much less. And in many cases, you won't even need to think about FinOps. You'll do FinOps, but you'll be 300% cheaper. So that's really the key. So we're all going to have a fun architecture project today, and I want you to look at the options, and then you can try to price it out your own way, and you'll see that there's just different ways to do it, and that's the biggest thing. Make sure we get the business thing first before we worry about how we're going to do the application. Is the business capabilities influence the reference architecture or vice versa? So this is a great question. So when I have an enterprise architecture, what is it about? An enterprise architecture is taking the people, making sure we've got the right people, making sure they do their jobs in the right way, and we have all the technology, whether that be robotics, AI, cloud, whatever, to support their needs. So when we design an architecture, there's two approaches. The tech-based approach, which never works, is here. There's AI out there, and let me determine this new cool AI thing I can create. And then the business uses it, and they don't get any benefit because the people that created the AI application didn't know what the employees of the company actually needed. So the way you design for digital transformation to true enterprise architecture is this. First thing we do is we learn that business. Then we map out the capabilities that business needs. For example, let's say we have a hospital. It's an emergency department. They need to determine which patients they see in which order. They may need to send someone for an X-ray. They may need to send them for a lab. They may need to document where the patient's medical records are. Those are business capabilities. And then the architecture we will create will be to support the business capabilities. So we always start with business, and then we work our way down to various levels of architectures. Great, great, great question. Okay, that's the last question. Then we'll get back to the content. So the translation of reference architecture, so solutions architecture, is more of an enterprise architecture responsibility or solutions architect, or presumably both. Actually, all three. So if we really look at what's going to happen, and actually I think I've got a slide that'll kind of help you with this along the way. Let's say we're dealing, and actually it might be 3 slides, but I'll kind of show you. So if we look at where we're focusing on the way, so if I'm an enterprise architect, my focus is really aligning the organization's people, the organization's processes, and the organization's technology, which means I might be leading an architecture team of 100. Now, I'm responsible for how people do their jobs. I'm responsible for building a roadmap of where the company's going for the next 10 years. I'm looking at the data architecture, application architecture, technology architecture. So that's not feasible for an enterprise architect. So as an enterprise architect, who's on my team? My network architects, my cloud architects, my security architects, my AI architects, my IAM architects. What are they called? They're called platform architects. So now, let's say I'm now working on a multi-cloud architecture. The enterprise architecture called for something. My cloud architects, we've chosen the cloud architecture. And my cloud architects are focusing on the conceptual architecture, saying, well, we're going to stick this in the private cloud because it's high throughput, high performance, and that'll be cheapest. We're going to put these web things that are always a scalability problem in 2 different cloud providers. That's my cloud architect. Now, then my solutions architect comes in for the website and creates the solutions architecture. The solutions architecture is going to be, okay, we're going to host your web app here. That web app is going to sit on these AWS EC2 instances that are going to be sitting behind this firewall. So that's the solutions architecture. So as enterprise architects, we create enterprise architectures. Our platform architects will dive deep in the various cloud platforms or security platforms or AI platforms. And then the solutions architects on our team are going to create that bill of materials. So we're going to have a full team that's going to have all these architects. Okay, so let's do this. Before we go back to the content, I want to remind everybody, in case you just joined us, that at the end of this boot camp, we actually have a book that's really going to help you as an enterprise architect. It was written by me and my good friend Jasser, and we're going to be releasing that on day 4. So sign up for it now. We'll send you that book on day 4. It's completely free. Tomorrow, we're going to be running a webinar on how to become a security architect. But seriously, if you want to be a cloud architect, an AI architect, or any other kind of architect, you feel free to join us, and we'll talk about architecture careers, and you can ask me any question. We run 2 per week, so no matter when you're seeing this, we'd love to see you. Love to meet you. So there's that. And if you're having a good time, hit the like button. Hit the subscribe button, ring the bell to be notified of new content for your architecture career, maybe share with a friend. See, one question came in. We will answer that at the next break. Chris, let's get back to the content.
Talk about why enterprise frameworks exist. And we're also going to talk about how to avoid architecture framework theater. So today we're going to get into frameworks, specifically enterprise architecture frameworks. And I promise you, this won't be a lecture about paperwork. So what people think frameworks are versus what they are very different things. Most people hear the word framework or enterprise architecture framework and immediately think templates, checklists, committees, and a folder full of documents nobody reads. And honestly, a lot of organizations have earned that reputation for a reason. But architecture frameworks aren't inherently bad. The problem isn't the framework. Enterprise architecture frameworks can be very valid and valuable. The problem is how people use them. And this truly matters in real enterprises because enterprise architecture is a team sport. It's not like we're going to have one smart architect that's going to make a diagram. It's going to be a team of people, whether that be stakeholders. We have to working within organizational budgets and organizational delivery time frames and compliance constraints that an organization may have. And the reality is that people are going to be hired by companies and leave companies. So we enterprise architects need to really think about how we use these frameworks. So the real question that we ask ourselves as enterprise architects is how do we create consistency without bureaucracy? And that's what we're going to talk about in this session. Why frameworks exist, like TOGAF or Zachman or other architecture frameworks. How to avoid framework theater, where there's lots of motion but no value going on. And when to adopt something versus ignore a framework based upon the organization's reality and maturity. So here's the lens that I want you to keep thinking of the entire time. A framework is a way that can help us work together. The framework is not the end. It's a tool that we can use to help us. And if your framework, your architecture framework, increases clarity, it increases alignment of various parts of the organization, and it increases confidence in delivery, your architecture framework is working. Now, if you're using an enterprise architecture framework and all you've done is increase your documents and and slow down your decisions, then you're not following anti-enterprise architecture framework. So let's talk about why enterprise architecture frameworks really exist. And it's really for about 4 reasons, and these reasons still matter today. And I'm going to keep this real practical because the moment this discussion becomes too theoretical, nobody's going to listen and we're going to miss the point. So the first reason we use enterprise architecture frameworks is repeatability. It's a structured approach that you can use every time. The way a doctor examines their patient the same way every time to make sure they don't miss something, that's what we're typically looking for, is that repeatability, that structured approach. So frameworks exist so we don't reinvent the method every single time. So Joey and Bubba and Sally's architectures aren't all so different. They're following the same process so they don't miss things. Because if we don't have a framework, here's what you're going to hear. Let's do some discovery. Let's make a couple of diagrams and let's schedule a review. And then everybody's going to argue about what good looks like. So the framework will give us a perspective. The frameworks are just seriously a set of steps. And if you look at a framework, it gives you certain patterns. Maybe it's how you discover what's going on. Maybe it's how you make your architectural designs. Maybe it's how you design something along the way, how you govern it along the way, but a standard way of doing things. So if we do things the same way, if that doctor examines their patient the same way every day, they don't forget stuff. So that's really what we're here. And that's what I really want you to think of. That. So the next reason, the second reason we're using architecture frameworks is governance. It comes up with some common decision points and some common about accountability. So when we think about governance, normally that's the word that gives us all a bit of the creeps. But governance done right is not bureaucracy. It's decision clarity. So frameworks create checkpoints. Okay, we're here. Let's check in with everybody. They may discuss decision rights, traceability of where things came from. Architecture frameworks tend to promote accountability as well. So if and when something goes wrong, or when leadership wants to know, why was this decision made? You're not guessing. So governance is not about controlling teams. It's about making decisions visible and reversible when needed, and holding people accountable because we know where things came from. Now, the next reason to use a architecture framework is a common language. Now, people in medicine, for example, use a common language. We don't use marketing names, we use trade names. So we would never say Sudafed, which would be a trade name, but we might say pseudoephedrine. And if you're a doctor in the US and the UK, it's going to be the same word. And that's what we're talking about here with an architecture framework. We come up with a standard set of languages, and that way you don't get things that mean different things to different people. For example, if someone says, I work with vulnerability, somebody sent me a message that said, I work with VMs. I said, are you referring to voicemail systems? I said, virtual machines or vulnerability management? And the person told me vulnerability management. But when we use an architecture framework, it stops that problem. Because we give shared terms like capability or building blocks or current architecture or 2B architecture or target architecture or baseline architecture, roadmaps, views, and viewpoints and principles. And that's a very practical benefit. We're all speaking the same language. Architecture is a communication sport, and at any time we miscommunicate, we create errors later. So this is very important. Now, the next reason we use architecture frameworks is scale. Small companies can easily keep alignment in people's heads in a small little folder. But when you're dealing with an enterprise at scale, that gets very complex. So you need a way to be consistent with your patterns, consistent with your decision-making, consistently evaluate trade-offs to a consistent manner, figure out what kind of guardrails are going to speed things up. And a framework can provide that umbrella which your teams can operate without turning every single decision into a debate. So in a large organization, your key enterprise, a framework's less about perfection and a whole lot more about coherence. So frameworks exist for repeatability, for good governance, so we're all speaking a common language and so we can scale. But here's the danger. Those same things that bring structure can also be used to create architecture theater, and that's not helping anyone. So let's talk about architecture framework theater, what that is, why it happens, and obviously how to avoid it. So framework theater is when an organization has all the appearances of a very good functioning enterprise architecture team, but they don't have any outcomes, and they're not getting anything from enterprise architecture. It looks like maturity, it feels like activity, but none of the work is changing direction. It's not delivering any kind of business results. So let's talk about some symptoms of framework theater. Lots of templates, but almost no decisions. Architects are spending their time filling in forms instead of talking to stakeholders and figuring out what the company really needs. Or we're doing TOGAF. We renamed our stages, but still we're doing the same thing. Documents get created in the framework theater. They get stored. You've got the most beautiful architectural repository you've ever seen, but the documents are never used again. So if your architecture repository were to disappear tomorrow, would delivery change? If the honest answer is not really, that's not using enterprise architecture framework properly. That's creating enterprise architecture theater. So why does this happen? Well, many times people mistake documentation for architecture. Documentation is not architecture. Architecture is about decisions. Often we see people, they just want to look professional by blindly standard copying everything. They send it to everyone, and people adapt to the outer shell of the templates and the phases, but they don't do anything. They don't change anything for inner purpose. Now, if there's no clarity on what every architecture artifact is, what the architecture artifact is for, does it support a decision, does it anything, it just becomes ritual. So again, it's not helping. So this kind of environment where we have framework theater, it's dangerous because it creates toxic outcomes. It provides confidence, but there's nothing to be confident about. Leadership thinks they're in control, but the risks are still there. We've got all this delivery friction where teams avoid architects because the architects aren't doing architecture, they're just slowing them down. And then we get into this environment with all this cynicism where architecture becomes a punchline. Oh, just call those people in the ivory tower. They'll say no anyway. So that is not real enterprise architecture. That is framework theater, and that destroys trust, and that's the anti-pattern of what we want to do as good enterprise architects. So here's how you avoid framework theater. First, start with a decision. What decision does this artifact support? If you created something and it can't support a decision of any kind, don't waste your time creating it because it's not going to do much. Now, keep your artifacts fit for purpose and lightweight. So if you can create an architecture artifact on a single page, do it. If it needs 5,000 pages, it's probably not going to be read. So try to keep your architectural artifacts as simple whenever possible. Now, in your architecture artifacts, I want you to focus on your outcomes. Better alignment, more clear decisions, risk reduction, faster start, something. So if you're dealing with architecture, what are we doing? We're supporting decisions. Everything we create is for a reason. We're focused on the outcome. And we consistently adapt and iterate our architectures just like a product. Architecture is not a one-time thing. Business changes, the economy changes, laws and regulations changes, and architecture will constantly need to be adapted. A new competitor comes out, architectures were there. And now that we've called out architecture theater, the next question is really a practical one. What should you actually adopt and what should you actually ignore? So if we think about building a toolbox for enterprise architects, I like to teach students to use the framework as a toolbox. Not a rule book. It's something to guide. And as anybody, it's better to have more tools in your toolbox. I don't care who you are. A physician that has more tools, more medications can save more lives. An architect that has more things they can use can create better outcomes. So think of it as a tool in your toolbox. I like to start with the smallest act that will produce real value. Now, let's talk about what you should typically adopt out of a framework that's typically high value for most people. Language. When everybody speaks the same language in an organization, mistakes don't get made. It's hilarious. When I started my career, I was in networking and I had just left internal medicine. I'm a nurse practitioner. And somebody literally called me and said, Mike, there's a whole bunch of PVCs in the middle of the night. And what they wanted me to do was bring up these help figure out the way for the frame relay circuits. But when they said, we've got all these PVCs, I said, issue a lidocaine bolus and then titrate a lidocaine drip to this. The person called me like, what are you talking about? I said, you talked about premature ventricular contractions and I'm giving you the treatment. And they said, no, Mike, I was talking about permanent virtual circuits. And that's why we have to speak the same language. It avoids errors. So here's the language I would want you to speak at in terms of an enterprise architect. Simple, plain language whenever possible, and a standard vocabulary that includes things like capabilities. What are the business capabilities we're trying to enhance? Views and viewpoints. Now that's going to be important because you may not be able to see everything on a single diagram, not that you would ever want to, and not everybody needs to see the same thing. I promise you the CEO does not want to know the IP addresses on various interfaces along the way. But I promise you this network architects or engineers definitely need that. So the views and the viewpoints, make sure you're showing the right thing to the right person. I do want you to think in terms of building blocks, architectural building blocks and solutions building blocks, but building blocks where the architectural ones are the main things, the solution building blocks are the actual services like that solutions architecture. I do want you to be thinking of reference architectures, and this is a common language, what it means to all people. And I do want you to be thinking of principles and standards. And, if you look at any way that we're doing a framework, it's really just guiding us through the few things. Discover what's going on, create a design, be able to make the right decisions, be able to realize some gains from it, and then govern it, and then just keep doing it again and again and again. So I like to go minimal with anything and then have more of my influence in terms of conversations. Really speak to the stakeholders, really speak to the execs, build relationships, learn what they need. That's enterprise architecture. And a minimal set of artifacts, for example, and I start here and add is what's needed, is a capability map. What does the business do? We have to know those business capabilities. If we don't, how are we going to enhance them? We don't even know what we're trying to do. You typically want to have a target architecture, which is where we're going. You typically, in your architectural repository, should have a roadmap, how we're going to get there out of these reference patterns and frameworks that we're using. We typically have some architecture principles, the way we make our trade-offs inside of our organization. And let's be fair, if you do these 4 things well, you're probably doing a better job than most. Now, what happens when we get into lower maturity organizations? Now, sometimes we may need to ignore or defer something. So what do I mean by that? We're not going to be looking at overly detailed metal models and modeling rules for someone that doesn't have a high level of architecture maturity. We're not going to be creating something too standard when we've got a massive library of mandatory templates to start with from the beginning. When we've got kind of heavyweight waterfall style phases where the organization delivers in agile increments. Because at that point, if we create too much bureaucracy, we're just going to kill adoption, and the goal is adoption of what we're trying to do. So here's how I would scale a framework by adoption maturity. If I've got a low maturity organization, I'm going to use a lightweight framework. I'm going to come up with core concepts. I'm going to use a few key architectural artifacts. I'm going to establish some fairly simple decision rights, and I'm going to focus on credibility and quick wins that are going to deliver real value for the business. Now, if I walk into a company that's got, say, medium maturity, potentially we add stronger governance, we add some more reusable patterns and reference architectures, and we build a bit of an architectural runway that the teams can actually use. Now, when we get into a high maturity organization, that's where we're going to look at our meta models from our frameworks, and we're going to see where do they add value, and only where do I add value. And we'll integrate enterprise architecture with that portfolio to reduce risk and improve finances, but we're going to make the architecture metrics visible. We're going to reuse various patterns, and the key is to reduce time to start and reduce costs, etc. So the practicality is adopts what's useful. 20% of these frameworks are probably what you're going to want to use, and 80% of it is often going to be bureaucratic until you're ready or you need it. So use what you need. So what we'll do is we're going to recap this fairly quickly, and then the next thing we'll talk about is the TOGAF framework. So frameworks exist for the following 4 reasons. Repeatability, so we do it the same way every time. Governance, to make it much easier to govern. A common language, so we're all speaking the same things and we avoid any kind of confusion. And scale. That's good enterprise architecture and the use of enterprise architecture frameworks. We don't want to get into framework theater where there's just a tremendous number of artifacts but no outcomes. And we'll avoid it by starting with a decision, staying lightweight and focused on outcomes. And for adoption, use the framework as a toolbox. An enterprise architecture framework is not a rule book. So start small, earn trust, and scale, and build maturity.
All right, we are back. So let's see if anybody has any questions. We always love answering questions. Hopefully you're all having a great time learning about enterprise architecture. I real sure hope everybody does. If so, maybe give this video a like, subscribe to our channel, and hit the bell to be notified of new videos. If you're just joining us, because with YouTube, we know people come in here and out over there, wanted to let everybody know that we have written a book that's going to come out with this course from Jasser and myself. Jasser's a great enterprise architect and a good friend. And that book will be available on the last week of this boot camp. So if you sign up now, my team will drop it in the chat box in the description of this video. You will get that enterprise architecture book that's going to be the corresponding book for this class on the last day of this program. So please sign up now. And again, we're going to have an architecture webinar tomorrow. It's Thursday, but we have one on every Monday and every Thursday. And tomorrow's is going to be about security architecture. But no matter your architecture curiosity, you could join any architecture webinar. And we'll talk about, the architecture career we're discussing, but we'll answer questions about any architect role you may have. So we might be talking about security architecture, but if you want to know about multi-cloud architecture or AI architecture, security, or any other kind of architecture, just ask. We'll do what we can to help you. So let's see if there was any questions. I think there was one that we didn't have a chance to finish from the last time. And then otherwise, see if any come in. Caleb, thank you so much. It is so good to see you, by the way. And I'm so happy you're enjoying the content. How does an architecture accelerate business? What a great question. So an architecture can, quite frankly, accelerate a business or destroy a business. The question is how the architecture is designed. So what do I mean by that? So the architecture is ultimately going to be the strategy for the way business is done. So if we can create a better strategy to make that business more efficient, then we can enhance the productivity of the employees, potentially the user experience of the customers, and make them more money. So let's give you an example. So let's say I have a sales rep and a sales engineer that needs to sell a technical product. Maybe they're selling a router or a switch. And let's say that the way it works right now is an inside sales rep books the meeting for the outside sales rep and the sales engineer. The outside sales rep goes to the client. They do a whole bunch of discovery, ask a whole bunch of questions. They then come back a few weeks later with answers to the questions. They take the client to lunch. Then the client asks questions. They don't know how to answer them, so they go back. And then this process gets repeated about 10 times. Before the customer ever buys anything, because every time the customer goes to the client, every time the sales engineer and sales rep go to the client, they don't exactly know what the client really wants, and they don't exactly know how to answer every question because the company's product set is too big. So sales is slow. It takes 10 or 11 visits. Now, let's say by comparison, the inside sales rep could also use AI and prepare a research brief when scheduling the appointment to the sales rep and the sales engineer. At the same time, that AI prepares the sales rep and the sales engineer on what they're most likely to expect in that client, what other analysts and industry experts are saying about that client, known business challenges and technology challenges of that client, at least whatever they can find, and prepares that sales rep for the first meeting. Well, maybe that sales rep and sales engineer now go on that first meeting and they wow the client. And the client likes it so much, they say, you know what, we love this. Could you come back with a principal architect to discuss these things? And they come back the next time with the principal architect, again, briefed with their AI tools, and they go back to the client. Maybe the client's so satisfied that they close the deal after 4 visits versus originally 10. Because that AI tool enabled that sales rep to do their job better by being predictive and knowing exactly what the sales rep and sales engineer needed. That would be an example of an architecture working. But if that application didn't provide what the reps needed and didn't answer the right questions, they could have the app and it would make no difference in the world. So that's an example of how it can actually make things better. Great question. What makes an architecture project truly legitimate? So I'm not sure that there's anything that's not legitimate, and I'll explain to you what I mean by that. If a business wants to go from making movies to making airplanes, they could do that. Now, it's probably not going to work because it's a different customer set and it's a different skill set. No, I don't think it's a good idea, but I guess it's legitimate. We can't say anything is illegal to do that. So what separates a good architecture, a real architecture, from something that just gets in the way? It's the alignment. When you really give that company exactly the tools that it needs to do a better job, you've got magic. An example of that was Walmart. It's still Walmart, but it was Walmart. When all the rest of the retail stores used to stockpile inventory and they didn't know what the customers needed, so they either ran out of stuff or they had so much inventory that at the end of the year nobody wanted it, so they had to deeply discount it. Companies weren't very efficient and they had to charge a lot of money to cover those costs. And then Walmart figured out, they were the first to figure it out of any of the major retailers, that if we know exactly what we need and we order it right before we're going to run out, but not before that, right at the same time we're going to run out, we don't have to spend a lot of money financing inventory. And we're not going to have excess stuff at the end of the year that we're going to have to discount and lose money on. So Walmart was able to sell a product cheaper and still make money on it when the other competition was losing. So that's an example of an architecture with the technology exactly aligned with the client's business needs. And look what happened. I mean, it's impressive as can be. Great question there in production. Hi, Mike. Does reference architectural principles, are they specific to a platform or are they specific to a problem in hand or a specific overall principle? So it can be a little of anything. So I could actually create a reference architecture for the way people do their jobs. And that reference pattern of, okay, I'm going to open a new bank branch, and here's the way, in certain ways we're going to do that. It can be that way where it's mostly how people should do their jobs when I'm mapping out things. Generally speaking, reference architectures are related to, here's how we're going to secure a demilitarized zone. Here's how we're going to map zero trust to an enterprise. Here's what our wide area network link is going to look like. This is what our branch office will look like, or our campus office. So it can be across platforms, but it often will be, because the network architects will have their reference architectures, which will be different than security reference architecture. So you'll have it in any subset of them. But great question. And I hope I answered your question. I guess the architectural principles, overall set of architectural principles for a specific project in hand. Well, it depends on how you define architecture. When we talk enterprise architecture and we talk about enterprise architecture principles, we're really talking about for the enterprise. If we're going to create an enterprise strategy, how are we going to do it? Who's going to be involved? How are we going to make sure it's the right strategy? How are we going to evaluate our options? Because we always have multiple options that we can choose. What are the trade-offs in those options? How do we score them? What languages do we speak? How do we communicate it? Where do we store our stuff? We make them up ideally for the organization, but we could also do them for a specific project. So there's really no rules in architecture. And as a rule, you may want like an enterprise architecture repository of the main stuff, and you may want detailed repositories with different views for different parts of it as well. And that's okay as well. So the key here is to make it what you need it to be. We're going to do TOGAF soon. And then we're going to do a full TOGAF live lab where we're going to work on something. And the key to remember with any of this is business 1 and business 2 are different. Marriage 1 and marriage 2 are different. Job candidate 1 and job candidate 2 are different. And the key is to play to whatever that business needs is, whatever that job candidate is, not the generic. Make it tuned to them. And then it's always better. Great questions here. Okay, so why don't we do this? We're going to go to content right now, and then we're going to pull these last questions in the next session, because I love answering these questions. These questions coming in are great. I'm thrilled that you're actually here. So we're going to get back to content. If you're having a good time, maybe give the video a like. If you're not a subscriber, maybe subscribe to this channel. Give me a hashtag enterprise architecture. We'll get back to this. And then after this, we'll get to some questions. Okay, we've been talking about enterprise architecture frameworks, and now we're going to talk about TOGAF. But we're going to talk about TOGAF in a manner that's going to be useful for you by the end of this lecture. We're not going to turn it into an academic experience. TOGAF is a toolbox for you to use. The key is not to worship any toolbox, any tool, not to love anything, but to be there as an objective strategic advisor. That's really why we're there as enterprise architects. So TOGAF is a tool. And, if you wonder, why are we even talking about TOGAF? Well, let's be honest. It's the most common enterprise architecture framework that you see out there. You'll find TOGAF in many job descriptions. Sometimes TOGAF is required. Sometimes TOGAF is preferred. And sometimes it's there just because HR just copied it from another cut and paste job description that they found. But when you are migrating towards enterprise architectural roles, you typically need a few things. One is great enterprise architecture skills. One is a strong set of business acumen. One is a strong set of leadership skills. But knowledge of architecture frameworks is important as well, especially enterprise architecture frameworks. And TOGAF is, in many cases, the one that you're probably going to be using. So I want you to have enough TOGAF literacy to communicate with people that are using it and who care about it. And that's kind of what you need to have as an enterprise architect. And enough real-world judgment to know how and when to use any enterprise architecture framework, whether it's Zachman or TOGAF, for when it's going to help you, and when you don't want to use it because you're going to create this kind of framework theater. So let's talk about what TOGAF actually is at a useful level. TOGAF is a framework that has, realistically speaking, about three major components, and you're going to hear about them constantly. One is the architectural development method, and I'll talk more about that. But the TOGAF architectural development method is a structured way to consistently create an architecture and iterate your architectures. Now, we'll talk about what that is. We'll talk about those phases as we go through the TOGAF Enterprise Architecture Framework. But that's the one component. Now, TOGAF also is a content framework in that it generally speaks about the types of architectural artifacts you should produce and what you would produce and the such, which is wonderful. And TOGAF also typically talks about how you store your documents and how you store your architecture artifacts in a way that they become easy to find. So yes, TOGAF could be a certification, but it's also a way to structure the work we do as enterprise architects and then reuse that pattern again and again. So this is not a certification lecture. I'm not here to help you memorize phase names, but I want to help you learn how to apply TOGAF in the real world. And that's what we're going to talk about. So toolbox. So let's talk about the TOGAF architectural development method. You may hear it called the TOGAF ADM. And we'll talk about the phases of what they are and what they mean in the real world. Now, the key to remember is we're talking delivery. And that's why we want to use this architectural development method. And I see it as kind of a mental checklist and an iterative loop, not a waterfall diagram, so to consistently go around and improve along the way. So if we use TOGAF, the ADM, as a checklist, so we have to answer these questions. Do we have a vision? Do we understand the business? And that's what it could help us with. Do we understand the data? Do we understand the applications? Do we understand the tech? Do we have a roadmap? Do we have a delivery governance? And are we keeping the architecture alive? So this is a real world environment, and TOGAF can be quite good for that. Now, real life is the key thing to remember. The architectural development method is iterative, not linear. It's a loop. And why is that? Well, let's say we go through the process, and we'll talk more about the process, but if we start here, and let's assume we finish an entire architecture development cycle, and I'm just going to call it finish here. What I want you to remember, as soon as we get this thing built,
I promise you something's changed in the market, so we're going to have to tune something. So we go from start to finish, and then we go back to start and tune certain things on for the next architecture, and this process consistently occurs. So it's not a one-time, one-step thing. I don't want you to think that it actually is, because that's just not who we are as architects. It's never a one-time thing. So we're going to begin in TOGAF with what you call the preliminary phase. And I'll tell you what we do in each of these phases and make it fairly simple for you. So we're going to begin in the preliminary phase. And here's the way I view the TOGAF preliminary phase. And I have a different view of it. It's how we determine what's in scope and what architectural principles are we going to use. And generally speaking, over here, we're going to figure out some decision rights. And, that's the basic thing of what we're starting with. And that's that preliminary phase. Now, as soon as we finish that, what are we really getting? A fairly small amount of architectural outputs, a lightweight review, a review of who makes the decisions, of what and when. We've got a very clear scope of what enterprise architecture owns and what product teams own. And that's that whole point of that preliminary phase. So that's what I want you to get to. Now, the next thing that we're going to get to, that next phase, is going to be the architecture vision. So we first set the scope, and now we go to the architecture vision. And what's going on here? Well, we're identifying the key business drivers. I may have to make this a little bigger as we go through this. We're identifying the stakeholders, and this is really critical. As we're going to need the stakeholders for their input, support, and buy-in later to create the architecture, we're typically going to find some constraints here. And this is really where we're looking for high-level direction. So, you can see how these phases are going. First, we go from that preliminary phase, and that's basically go learn what you have. And then the preliminary phase is, who are your stakeholders? What are the constraints that we have? And why do we want to do this in the first place? So by the end of that architecture vision, that phase A stage, we should have a practical output, a document that explains the vision, a narrative that executives can understand and talk about to other executives, a high-level scope, and the risks and assumptions we have. So that's where we're at with that next phase. So if you really look at this, and obviously the next phase we'll talk about, which is the business architecture, but let's realistically look at what we've done here. What are we doing for the most part? Who makes the decisions? What have you? What's the scope? Then we've determined what are we trying to do? Who are the key stakeholders? What are the primary business things we're trying to do, high-level direction? So that's going to be phase 2. Now, phase 3 is really about the business itself. We can't design an architecture for competitive advantage if we don't know what we're knowing. So when we get here, we're starting to talk about the business architecture to the next phase. Now, what is business architecture? It's about what the business does, really. So when we map out a business architecture as an enterprise architect, we're going to be mapping out the business's capabilities, typically with a capability map. We're going to be mapping out value streams, which is how we go from, say, a raw material to a finished product, how that company would make money. And we're probably still focusing a bit more on stakeholders. And what's going to be the output of the business architecture? Well, a couple of things. We need to have a capability map because we figured out the business's capabilities. We have to talk about what's changing and why. If we're changing the way the business does something, why are we doing it? Or if the sales reps aren't doing their job because they're doing it the wrong way, then we're changing the process. So why are we changing what we're changing? And then the phase of business architecture, we need to figure out where the business needs to change, where they can be flexible, where they need to standardize. Because if you think about it, capabilities are stable, but projects are temporary. And that's why credit capability maps evolve, because the business may become able to do more things over time. So if we talk about the next phase, we're actually talking about the data and the application architecture. I don't know why TOGAF puts them together, but they actually put them together into the information systems architecture, which is the next phase. And what they have in here is we have the data architecture, and then we have the application architecture. Now remember, we're not solutions architects, so our data architectures will have different things. For example, our application architectures probably have a high-level application map. Our application architectures at an enterprise architect level may have major system and integration points. The enterprise architecture level, our architectures may include ownership boundaries and dependencies. And you may think about that for the application architecture. Now, at the enterprise architect level of a data architecture, we may have things like data domains, key entities that matter. We may have some, say, data flows and boundaries. And of course, what's the source of truth for the data? And this is where many digital transformations and things go wrong, where teams modernize applications without aligning the data, or they move data without controlling it. So lots to go wrong on the data side. And that's typically why this is so important. Now, the next phase in TOGAF is the technology architecture. So, and we'll talk about the difference between the technology versus the data and applications in a second. Now, when we get into this technology architecture, which I spelled obviously wrong while I typed this in real time live, what we're talking about in the technology is the infrastructure, the platforms, the shared services. So the technology architecture could be your data centers, your routers, your switches, your servers. It could be your robotics kind of things. It could also be your cloud provider. But the key here is the output of your technology architecture is going to be your target platform patterns. What are you doing on the compute? What's your network architecture look like? What's your identity architecture look like? Your observability, for example. Do we create a shared services catalog? What can teams reuse? What kind of constraints and guardrails can we come out for our technology? And the key is the technology architecture should make things easier. So at this point, if you really look at what we have so far, and I want to try to walk through it, what are we going to do? What are we trying to do from a business perspective? Who are the stakeholders? And then really having conversations with the business executives to map out the business architecture and create a new business architecture with the executives, how things want to be in the future. Then we're mapping out the data architecture, the applications, and then the technology. Now, when we're still here at this level, we're at an architecture level. And that means we might be talking about routers and switches, but we're not going to define them as Cisco routers and switches. We may be saying we need virtual machines, but we're not going to be defining them into an AWS EC2 instance, an Azure virtual machine, or a compute engine instance. Not yet. Because right now, we're still focused on the bigger, higher level components of architecture until now. And that's where the next phase is going to be called opportunities and solutions. And I'll show you what that means right over here. And we're running out of space in my PowerPoint. Now let's talk about what happens in this opportunities and solutions phase. Now this is where the architecture we created becomes executable. This is where we translate the architecture into the actual initiative, the actual programs that we're talking about, and everything that needs to occur. So at this point, when we're creating this opportunities and solutions, we're figuring out some of the stuff that's actually going to be used. Some of the technologies that'll actually be used. And that's why it's fundable work at this point, because we know exactly what we're trying to do. We'll translate the architecture and what it needs to be here to actually be fundable and be built. Now, if we look at what we've got so far, The first thing we're doing is figuring it out. The second thing is what business things are we trying to achieve and identify our stakeholders. Then we're having conversations with the business stakeholders, mapping out the business, figuring out all the business, figuring out the way we want the business to work in the future, new processes, etc. Then we evaluated the data, the application, the technology. Then we figured out specific technologies for it. Now we've got to plan the migration, whatever it is. And I'll call it migration planning. And then I'll show you what I would like to call it. So I like to look at it this way. This is point A, where we are now, and this is point B, where we want to go. So whenever you think of migration planning, we're really building a plan to go from what we have, the as-is architecture, to the to-be architecture. And in that, we'll create a gap analysis of what's missing between A and B and then figure out how to get there. So that's going to be what we do in the migration planning. So let me talk a little bit more about this phase of migration planning. Now, when we get through the migration planning phase, what are we trying to do? We're trying to sequence the plan. Okay, so what are we doing now? What are we doing in the intermediate? What's the ultimate goal? So we're creating a roadmap with changes that occur. Can we make it all as one change? Or do we need to make incremental changes to get there like we usually do? Something needs to change before we can do the ultimate goal. We typically will create some milestones here in this migration planning phase. So what ultimately is going to get us to there quicker? We'll typically align our portfolio and funding cycles to the migration to make sure we've got the resources to do it. Because if you can't sequence it, if you can't figure it out, you can't fund it, and then it won't happen. So the next phase here is, typically speaking, something called implementation governance. And I'll explain to you what that is in a minute. So when we're in implementation governance, the goal here is to create governance over the implementation. So there's project guidance. Somebody makes sure that we're reusing architecture patterns. Somebody makes sure that we're reviewing key decision. And someone makes sure that we're managing exceptions. So to take a practical approach, what we're trying to do here with implementation governance is short, predictable reviews, reusable reference architecture patterns, architecture decision records that say what we did and why we did it. And the focus here is on risk alignment, not on paperwork. Now, the key to remember is things change. And as things change, we need to change. So that also means we need to factor in change management and everything that's necessary to make changes inside of an organization. And this is kind of going to be absolutely critical. Now, how critical is change management? Some data shows that if you don't have a good change management system, the chances of your architecture being successful are minimal. So change management is going to be really critical. How do we approach change? How do we manage change? How do we keep that architecture alive, moving forward as time passes on? So that's change management. So architecture change management is keeping a loop up. So we're constantly able to changes when they need to occur. So we have to be able to make changes. But if we make changes, what's going to be the impact to the business? We always have to consider these things. So if you think about architecture becoming a living system, patterns will evolve, obsolete standards will change, obsolete gear will go out, we'll respond to new risks, and that means things are changing constantly. So we're going to use that change management as an approach to do it. How do we make a change? Who approves the change? How does somebody assess the impact of a change? And that's typically what we're dealing with change management. Now, let's say we've got an architecture and it's a small change. We run it through change management. Now, what happens if we've done all of this? We've went through all these phases. We created our architecture. And now all of a sudden, somebody wants to make a major change over here. What do? We don't address it in change management if it's major. We go right back here and start a new architectural development method. Minor change goes through change management. Re-architecting something goes through this whole cycle all over again. And there's various flavors of TOGAF 8, 9, 10. But realistically, what we're speaking about is creating that actual environment, creating that standard language, creating that standard set of steps. Let's talk about that architectural repository and building blocks and viewpoints, since we're talking about TOGAF, and TOGAF heavily discusses these concepts. So what are we actually talking about? Well, we want to make sure if we're going to create an architectural repository, it's useful. And it'll clarify various viewpoints. It'll clarify whether things are architecture building blocks or solutions building blocks. And it's where we're going to go to look to find information, architectural decision records, and so many other good things. So when we think about an architecture repository, and the TOGAF calls for one, as do most frameworks, it's really a central place to store your reusable architecture knowledge, industrial knowledge, so we can keep getting better. So, for example, principles and standards that we would have created will be in the architecture repository. Reference architectures and patterns will be in your architecture repository. Key models and diagrams should be in your architectural repository. Architectural decision records should be in your architectural repository. Reusable building blocks that are going to make it easier to do things again and again and again, they definitely should be in your architectural repository. And what you want to do with your architecture repository is to make it easy for your architects and your teams to find content that they can reuse, so they don't have to start from scratch. But it has to be simple. It has to be elegant, because if it's too complex, no one will actually get it. So if your repository isn't helping your teams move faster, it becomes more like a museum instead of an architecture repository. So what belongs in your architecture repository and what doesn't? What belongs are things that are reused by teams, decisions that need traceability, standard patterns and guardrails, and templates that work. Now, what don't you want to have in your architecture repository? Remember, we want to make it easy to find stuff. If it's impossible to find stuff, nobody uses it. So in our architectural repository, we don't really want to keep a bunch of dead documents nobody reads, or overly detailed one-off product descriptions stored as a standard, or multiple competing versions of a standard that has no owner. Make it clear, if nobody reads anything in your architectural repository, it's not an architecture repository. It doesn't do things. And if nobody wants to reuse it or read it, it doesn't belong there in the first place. So let's separate building blocks and separating concepts from implementation a little bit. So TOGAF uses the idea of building blocks to separate the logical from the physical. And an architecture building block is a logical capability for the business, or it's a logical capability diagram, like an API gateway, or an event streaming platform, or an identity provider. Now, when we get into solutions building blocks, it's going to start to feel a lot more like a solutions architecture than that enterprise architecture. And when we're here, it's the Cisco router, it's the AWS service when we get to that solutions building block, or that Palo Alto firewall model. That's typically where we're talking about the product, the vendor. And that's different than the architectural building block, which is the bigger picture. And by having both architectural building blocks and solution building blocks, and that's a key component of TOGAF, it's going to help enterprises standard the what, the why, and how they document and how they create. And by creating it, it creates an environment that allows people to make choices amongst what's there when things are appropriate. And it supports multiple implementations of similar logical building blocks. So the goal here with anything else of doing this, creating this repository, is acceleration and speed, so we don't redo the work at the same time everywhere in between. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about solutions building blocks and architectural building blocks. Now, another thing we need to think about in TOGAF is views and viewpoints. Now, the best way I can describe it is different stakeholders need different views of the same architecture. So if I have a C-suite, they're very concerned about risk and revenue and investment choices, what have you. And something that I would share with the C-suite would be related to that. At the same time, my network architect may need to know some pretty deep things about the network, and they may need a different view than my executives would be. So when we start talking about views and viewpoints, we're talking about who's going to be seeing them and who they're actually meant for. So who's it for? And that's the first thing that we want to decide. Now, when we define a viewpoint, it's whose concerns are you addressing? Are you addressing the viewpoint of the CEO? Are you addressing the viewpoint of the engineer? Because different people care about different things. The viewpoint represents how you define the architecture, what kind of modeling conventions you use, and what level of detail is appropriate. Executives don't want the tech mumbo jumbo details, but the people that are going to implement it might. So we need to have different viewpoints for different people. And, it's not going to be an environment where a single diagram will satisfy everyone. Viewpoints are silly to create a different perspective for the audience and what the audience actually needs. So let's talk about some practical guidance on TOGAF and other things. Don't model everything. That's how repositories become graveyards full of documents that no one wants to see and a whole lot of waste of time. Focus on key building blocks that are going to be reused again and again for acceleration. Focus on a small set of viewpoints, like what the executives might need, for example, what the solution view might be, what the data view might be, and what the platform might be, like the platform view. And the goal isn't completeness. I mean, we can create anything complete, but if nobody reads it, it's useless. And the goal here, we're trying to talk about how to use TOGAF properly, is usefulness and making sure that we have things. So let's talk about some common failure patterns and where things typically go wrong. Repositories that have no ownership. Because that way, you've got something, all this information is there, nobody owns it, nobody knows about it, and the contents just rots. Architecture building blocks that are so vague, teams don't know what it means. That's completely useless as well. If we've got a solution building block that's so strict to a specific set of services, then innovation will probably get blocked. And let's be fair, in many cases, we can't have one standard that's going to fit the edge cases either. But we don't want to have too many exceptions either, so we need to think about what's appropriate for us. If we don't define our viewpoints, then the wrong person is going to see the wrong information and nobody's going to be helped. And I almost would treat architecture development method as a waterfall. Slow gates, one thing at a time. Try it, test it, document it, process. I love the repeatable process. I love it. And that repeatable process is so useful for us. But remember, TOGAF is just a tool. So cherry pick on purpose how you're going to use TOGAF. Use the architecture development method as a guide and a checklist, not a mandatory sequence. Use building blocks to separate concepts from implementation. Use viewpoints to communicate effectively. Don't force the terminology. Don't force TOGAF language in an organization that already has its own vocabulary. Map the concepts instead. Make sure there is a capability map somewhere along the line, but it could also exist in product strategy, so make sure we're talking about the same thing. And in many cases, understand that there are certain things. Target architecture, for example, could be to be or future state. So let's model what the organization is using if they have a common vocabulary and map it back. So your job as an enterprise architect is not to speak like TOGAF, just so like you don't want to look like you or sound like you passed any certification exam. You're there as a strategist. So if you think about integrating TOGAF with your project lifecycle, your governance and portfolio process, your risk and compliance workflows, and your operating models, you'll be great. So I like to say, know TOGAF well enough to think clearly and communicate it. But adapt it, and you may have to tune it ruthlessly for the real world. But anything that helps us approach our customers in a structured manner, in a repeatable manner to deliver better quality, lower cost, and lower risk is definitely great.
Okay, we are back. So I see there's a couple of questions. We'll take the questions. We'll see how you're doing. And Chris, I think we have some more content, and then we're going to do a real TOGAF walkthrough from the beginning to the end. We're going to use a bit, no more content. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a TOGAF walkthrough, where I'll walk you through an organization. We'll talk about everything that we need to do for that organization, and we'll take it from the business perspective all the way down to that solutions architecture. We'll have some fun with it. So let's see if anybody has any questions, and we'll get to that. What would I recommend for a first-time enterprise architect? How would they conduct a session using any of these frameworks for the first time? So if you're working in enterprise architecture, you're not going to conduct anything via framework. What really happens for your first time as an enterprise architect is you need to walk into the organization. You need to build your strategic relationships. You need to figure out who the key decision makers are. You need to figure out who the key stakeholders are. You need to figure out who's considered valuable, those types of folks inside of that organization. And you're going to need to build real relationships with them. Because if you have no relationships, there is no architecture. And realistically speaking, if that's not the case, where you just got brought in as an enterprise architect, like for example, let's say you were like me, where you were chief architect, you were at Cisco, and someone says, Mike, I would like you to work with this healthcare organization. First thing I would do is I would meet with the executive sponsors. And when I meet with the executive sponsor, I'd say, could you tell me exactly what your goals are? Okay, you'd like to achieve this. Okay, could you tell me how you would measure success? Are you going to measure it in revenue? Are you going to measure it in reduced patient errors? Or are you going to measure it in improved customer experience? Because that's the target of what we're trying to achieve. Now, in that first meeting, I'm going to try to figure out who the key players are, because I know that executive sponsor may only be able to spend a half an hour with me. But in order to figure out what I need for my architecture, I may need to have 30 to 300 conversations, and I'm not joking, for the next 6 months to even figure out what I have inside of enterprise. So the first thing I would want you to do is really start at the top. So, and determine is figure out what problem you're trying to solve. And then after that, you're going to build an architecture team to figure out what they have. And then after that, you're going to build your architecture team to design what they need. Then ultimately, you'll present it back to the stakeholders, get their feedback, and then you and your team will tune it until you've got support for your architecture. Then at that point, you'll create the actual solution architecture, which we're going to do together. And then after that, you will pitch it and sell it to the C-suite and the board to get it funded. And then after that, you'll be working on another project, and there'll be an engineering team that's going to build it. So we're going to walk through the entire steps of the TOGAF. But first-time enterprise architect, don't think architecture framework. Think what you're really doing. You are there as a strategy consultant to walk in that organization, understand their business goals, their business pain points, the regulatory environment, their business challenges, what their competitors are doing, and how to make them better. That's the job. And it's the most fun job ever. Because what you're really being consulting on is, how do I make you better? Hope that helps. Why don't you join the Enterprise Architect, How to Become an Enterprise Architect webinar tomorrow. We're going to talk much deeper about what we do in the role, every step of what we do, the skills you need. I think it'll be very helpful for you. You joined late and you're not sure if you're asking the right question. That's okay. Ask it anyway. How do you use TOGAF theory certification knowledge to land your job as an architect from service management? You don't. What you do is you learn how to become an enterprise architect. So let's talk about the difference between the TOGAF certification and what you need to know as an enterprise architect. TOGAF is simply a list of steps. And the list of steps are fairly basic. So the first thing we're going to do is determine what the customer wants to achieve. After we figure that out, then we're going to go map out the business architecture. After we figure that out, then we're going to look at their data architecture, the application architecture, and figure that out. Then we're going to look at technology. That's what TOGAF says. But what it doesn't do is teach you how to do any of those things. So you have to learn how to be an architect first and then get TOGAF. Now, I'll talk much more about it tomorrow, but when it comes to architecture careers, there's really 4 pillars of skills you need to learn. And if you have these skills, you'll be able to do the job. And what we're really talking about is this, because it's a great question. You know, you need to have the technical knowledge to be able to do your job. And I'll give you a little window into what that is. You have to have the executive skills to do this job, because you can't do the job without the executive skills. You have to have the right level of communication skills to even be able to do the job. And then you have to have the business acumen to do the job. Now, after you have this, that's when you get TOGAF, because the TOGAF won't teach you any of these things. And what do I mean by skill pillars? So from an enterprise architect or even a cloud architect, we need to understand application architecture. We need to understand what kind of compute options we could choose. When do we use a bare metal server? When do we use a virtual machine, for example, or a container or a function as a service? What do each ones do well? What do each ones not do well? What are the trade-offs? And this same thing goes for data architecture and IAM architecture, network architecture. They're your real technical knowledge base. And I'll spend about 2 more minutes on this. Then you've got your executive skills pillar. And here's the reason. You ultimately will be managing stakeholders throughout your architecture, advising the C-suite and the board, guiding the organization through change, being able to manage the C-suite and the board, hence the executive prevalence and relevance, and convincing the board and C-suite to fund your architecture. Now, our world's all about communication. We're creating architectural artifacts. We're going to create some together in a few minutes. We're going to be writing for executives. We're going to be obtaining information. We're going to be giving architectural presentations. And then the business skills side of it is, remember, we have to map out business architectures, business strategy, business capability maps. We have to build business cases on why the company should fund the architecture. And that means we need to know finance and these things. So that's your basic set of skills. And this is the best job. And here's why it's so great. Almost no one has these skills. And that puts you in a place where everybody in the world needs architects like this, big companies, and they can't find anybody. And when there's a huge demand and no supply, you've got a great salary. So join the webinar tomorrow and we'll go through the entire process on how to get hired. But I just want to make sure we get rid of the myth that TOGAF is not enterprise architecture. It's just a series of steps to help you think better. Great question, though. Ahmed, for organizations who are less mature with little or no governance, how do you keep stakeholders on the same page with what priorities if there isn't a top-down guidance? That's your job, is to create that structure. Your job is to create maybe an architectural review board. Your job is to create a business case for creating the architecture and people investing their time in their architecture. Your job is to come up with a stakeholder communication map and a stakeholder communication strategy and when you're going to do that. And then it's your job to sell that to get everybody to adopt it. And Ahmed, you do that and you deliver real results, you'll be very close to the chief architect, CTO level fairly quickly. Great question. Especially if you walk into an organization, they've got no governance, they have chaos, and then you fix it. Oh, they're going to love you. In the case of framework theater situation, what would be the suggested approach to fix it without harming business continuity? Here's the key to avoid realized framework theater. Framework is a guide. You know, if you were going to examine a patient from head to their neck, you would start eyes, ears, nose, throat, carotids, for example. You'd look in the throat. There's a process to it. And the key is TOGAF is just saying those steps. So if you adhere to TOGAF, and we're going to go through a real rapid one soon, and we're going to show you exactly, how to not do it as in theory. And then I think that'll make itself. So just don't overdo it. Don't try to create every document that TOGAF tries to create. Don't try to name everything that way. Try to take the best of it, what you need, and then just let the rest go. Let go what doesn't serve you, as my yoga instructor friends would love to say. Great question. We have a principal cloud architect who uses AI to make shelfware documents. How can you motivate the culture to change? There are policy writers and practitioners don't even know exist. So generally speaking, if you've got an architect, and I can't necessarily know your exact situation, but if you've got an architect that's once been super technical, and then they go into a room with the executives, they present something technical to executives, the executives hear it, and the executives say, I don't know why that person took my time. I have a headache. They're not coming to talk to me again. What happens, that person goes and creates document after document after document after document because they don't know what else to do. They're not welcome to the big meetings, but they still want to do their job and still get paid. So that's what they tend to do. in that kind of environment, you got to try to create a get well plan for that architect to try to figure out if they lack the business acumen, how to give it to them quick. If they lack the executive skills, how to give it to them quick, and then how to rebrand them so that the rest of the people in the company will take them seriously. That might mean mentoring them. That might mean coaching them. That might be reintroducing to people after you've worked their way up a little bit. But that's usually what it takes, because if people are just writing content, they don't usually stay in the company that long, unfortunately. That's not the architect's job. You're there for strategy, not just making shelfware documents. Does the Go Cloud Enterprise program prepare the individual to take and pass the TOGAF exam without using any studying materials courses? Yes, absolutely. Our enterprise architect program, first it teaches you how to be an enterprise architect, because that's the real goal. But there's no other materials needed for TOGAF 10. Just the content of the training in there was very extensive, very, very extensive. The program is basically the study materials and the course. So first, how to be an architect, and then everything also to pass the TOGAF and anything else you would need. Great question, Darnell. I'm like, what are the boundaries of solution governance and enterprise architecture and review boards? Is the enterprise architect responsible for the solution success? So we're not doing the solutions. And generally speaking, that's not how you're going to measure you. So here, I'm an enterprise architect, and I've been hired because the company is an e-commerce retailer. They do $13 billion of sales on the website. They hired me because they want to increase the revenue on the website from 13 billion to 14 billion. That's how I'm going to be measured as an enterprise architect. Did it work? Now, I'll also be measured for, is it easier for the organization to make technology changes in the future? Did the systems meet the performance, meaning we didn't lose money because systems were down? So I'm going to be judged for that. But mostly what I'm going to be judged on is, did the business make money? Now, my engineers are going to be judged on system uptime and system performance, because that's their job. Remember, this is an executive job. This is a job to help the client make better decisions. So you will be judged by your decisions. The solutions architects are a little closer to delivery. They might ask them these questions. The engineers definitely are going to be there. But remember, we're not creating the solution success. We're creating the transformation roadmaps, the alignment of the people, the processes, the technology. Our platform architects are doing the heavy-duty network architect, cloud architect, security architect, or AI architect work. And then the solutions architects are the people that come in from the vendor who try to convince us to use their stuff. So that's kind of where the board is going to be and where all we're going to play. Hope that helps. Great question. From Jasper, any real hands-on work that you do in the enterprise architect program? You do a lot of hands-on enterprise architect work. So every job has a different hands-on. The hands-on for an airplane pilot, you can fly in the plane, what have you. It looks like fun. The hands-on work of a surgeon is doing surgery. The hands-on work of an engineer is Terraform and Linux and, cloud providers, CLIs. And the hands-on work with an enterprise architect is interviewing a client, delivering an architectural presentation, creating an architectural artifact. And yes, our students get deeply hands-on. Jasper, I do give my students the opportunity to build clouds and do other fun things hands-on too, to enhance their capabilities. But the real hands-on work is really, hands-on architecture work. And our students get heavy-duty hands-on architecture work. And they stay in the program, generally speaking, until they're hired. So lots of opportunities for hands-on architect work. Great question. So let's kind of have some fun. Give me a hashtag TOGAF, and we're going to walk through a simple enterprise architecture, and we're going to have some fun with it. We're going to start at the top. I'm going to read you a case study, and the case study is going to be like a real environment. So let me set up my scenario here so we can go through this. I did a little bit of drawing today. I am not Mr. Graphics, so I had a little fun, but I did my best. So here is the situation. Everybody listen, so we can get the vision, and we'll map it out together. So here's the story. In the state of Sunnyland, there's been a massive population explosion. Sunnyland has very warm weather. It's got an extraordinary friendly business environment, and it has no income taxes. So in the last few years, everybody caught wind, and there's been a massive influx of people to Sunnyland. The Sunnyland population increase was so big that 3 million additional people have come in the last 2 years. Now, this looks great on paper, but this growth of Sunnyland has caused a bunch of challenges as well. Because of this population influx, the healthcare system has been incredibly overwhelmed. It could take over 6 months to see a doctor for a medical problem. 6 months. And this is for things that are important and matter too. So realistically, in Sunnyland, one of two problems exist in healthcare. One is the patient waits 6 months to be seen by a doctor after, for example, and they get a lot sicker. And when people get sick, they die, their healthcare costs go expensive. The other option we have right now is for the people in Sunnyland to go to the emergency department, wait in line for 8 hours, and rack up a $4,000 or $5,000 bill for what could have been performed in any kind of doctor's office or urgent care center for less than $250. So as it turns out, there's a billionaire that wants to come in. The billionaire would like to meet everyone. I'll introduce her to you. The billionaire is Queen Cindy. And Queen Cindy is gonna fix it. She wants to create a 30-bed urgent care center. And instead of an urgent care center that normally has one doctor or a nurse practitioner and a huge wait, they're going to tackle the healthcare challenges in Sunnyland by creating this 30-bed, massive freestanding urgent care center that's going to have 10 doctors at all times. That's about 5 times more than a standard emergency department. And by doing so with these 30 beds, they expect to be able to handle most of the emergency traffic in South Sunnyland. So while they're in South Sunnyland, that is going to be their goal, to create this kind of environment. Now, they want to make this urgent care center so big and so powerful that when the local hospitals' emergency departments fill up, meaning they get full and they can't take any more patients, ambulances for non-life-threatening issues will take the patients to this urgent care center. So that's the vision. So that's the first part of an architecture. So let's map out the vision. Let's go through as if it was a TOGAF architecture. We'll start looking at the vision, what we're trying to achieve, what have you. So we're going to create the vision. And what is this vision supposed to be? Just make sure we understand it. Let's put a text box here. Make sure. So the vision is to create a 30-bed, freestanding urgent care center. To make this bigger so we can use bigger text, so it's easier to see. In addition to the 30-bed freestanding urgent care center, they want to take ambulance traffic. And the CEO, Queen Cindy, says if it works here in South Sunnyland, she wants to roll it out to all kinds of big cities. So that's the plan. That's the vision. So if we think that we're going to be creating this freestanding center, well, what's that business going to have to do? So we went through TOGAF Phase A. TOGAF Phase A is trying to figure out what we're trying to achieve for the most part. Now, TOGAF Phase B is going to be about the business. So if we think of this situation, we have to look at the architecture of the business. And what will the business need? So we're going to map out the capabilities. I mapped a few to make it a little easier to go through. So let's walk through some of this, and then we'll look at an org chart. Maybe we'll map out various components of the business architecture as well. When someone comes into the emergency department, we have to know who they are. They're going to have to register. For example, they're going to have to say, I'm Sonny, or they're going to have to say, I'm Sammy, or I'm Nikolaus, or whatever. So we need to register the patient. Now, we also might want to do follow-up care. Like maybe you came in today for an emergency, but we want you to come back in 2 weeks after we take your cast off or what have you, or your splint off. So we have to be able to schedule visits for the future. Now, when you walk into this emergency department, I have to be able to determine who to see first. And that's called triage. Because if someone comes in and they're having a hard time breathing, that's an emergency. I got to treat them first. But if somebody came in and they had a little laceration on their finger, I might be able to keep them there for an hour because it's not critical. So we need to sort or to determine who we're going to see next. Now, somewhere along the line, we're going to have to document everything that happened to the patient. So we're going to need some form of documentation. We're going to need to send the patient for labs where we check their blood. We might check their urine, what have you. Somebody comes in and they complains that their arm hurts. I'm going to order an X-ray of their arm, so we have to be able to do images. When a patient's ready to leave, we have to be able to send them home. And we can't just say, here, get out of here. You've been to the hospital, go home. I mean, seriously, someone came to a medical facility for a reason. We have to send them home with what to do. Okay, you've got this wound. We cleaned your wound. We stitched up your wound. We covered your wound. Here's how you're going to need to care for it. Here's the medications you need to take. Here's when you come back. So that's called discharge planning, and we have to do that. Now, the other thing we have to be able to do is referrals. And here's what a referral is. Patient came to me. I practice internal medicine, and I noticed that they have some significant cardiovascular challenges. Well, I'm there for primary care. I'm going to send them to a cardiologist. So the referrals to the specialists. And then the last business capability we need for this clinic is we have to bill for it. You know, billionaire Cindy is not going to keep funding these things if she doesn't make money along the way. So she needs to bill. So, you know, that's the first thing we need to figure out is these are the capabilities, because guess what? These capabilities are going to soon drive our application architecture, our data architecture, our solutions architecture, our technology architecture. So it's going to be fun. So we'll get to that. So when you look at an organization, somewhere along the line, you're going to need to determine who's in charge. How is it going to flow? And this is that first phase of the architect, where we focus on the architecture vision. And what's that look like? Well, I drew an org chart. So in this particular org chart, you'll notice that Queen Cindy is in charge of everything. Queen Cindy has her chief operating officer who runs the company. She's got her chief financial officer that takes care of the finances. She's got her chief technology officer that helps with technology strategy and works with the chief architect. She's got her chief information officer. She's got her C-suite. And for the most part, these are going to be the people we're probably going to work with inside of our architecture. These are the main people. And of course, we'll ask these people, while we're in that first meeting, who the other people are that we're going to play with. So that's the org chart. So that's typically what we're going to do. And while we're in this phase, we would probably walk through the steps of actually running things. So let's say we go over here. So let's look at the business architecture. So let's say here's how this is
Mike,
going to work.
I need you to share your screen.
Okay, so we're going back to the business architecture. We're going to look at a key business process. So how is this client going to serve? How are we going to serve new clients when they walk through, when they come in, for example? So here's your client. The client's going to go to registration. After they go to registration, they're going to be sorted. They're going to be triaged to determine, the priority. And then the triage will determine the process. It could go straight back. And then triage will determine, do they send the patient here? Now, while they're back here, whatever kinds of labs and treatment things need to occur. Treatment. Then there's a discharge. This is the way it's supposed to work. And then we'll add one last step. We're doing these live, so everything's a little harder when you try to diagram live. And then bill. So this is business architecture, realistically speaking, of what it's supposed to look like. That's the way things are going to occur. So that's TOGAF Phase B. What were the capabilities this organization needs? What are the key business processes or workflows and the way people use the job? Because the applications and things have to support that. And when we're done that, who are the key players or org charts? So that's basically TOGAF Phase B. So now we're going to get into TOGAF Phase C, which is where we're going to define the data and the application architecture. So look, good news. This is a brand new urgent care facility. So it's not like they have anything we have to map out. We're just going to create the new one. So let's start with the application architecture. Let's think of the applications we're going to need. So let's list them out. So we're going to list the main applications we're going to need. So we are going to need a scheduling app. To handle the scheduling. We are going to need a triage app, so we don't forget who's sitting in the waiting room. We are going to have to document the clinical care that we use. And the types of applications that do that are called electronic health records. Now, we need to be able to order labs like blood tests on people. So that means we need lab systems or lab applications. We need X-ray. We need imaging applications to perform X-rays. I need an application to discharge a patient so that when someone goes home from a broken arm, they now have a cast, they know what to do. And I don't have to write the notes from scratch every single time. So I need discharge systems. I'm going to need systems for me to make referrals. For example, we saw somebody with a fracture. We want them to see an orthopedic surgeon. So we need a system for referrals. And we're going to need a billing system. So these are the applications we're going to need. We'll turn these into a solutions architecture later. That's the applications architecture. What's the data architecture going to look like in this particular thing? Well, we're going to talk very high level of data architecture right now. We're not going to go too heavy. Let's not do that. So the data owners, for the most part, are going to be owned by the execs. We have to classify the data, the sensitivity of the data. We would do part of our data architecture. We would map this out. And what do you think the sensitivity of this data is? Very sensitive, because it's medical data. Anything inside of the electronic health record, again, is going to be sensitive data. So we're going to have to make sure we've got a strategy to make sure data can't be exfiltrated out of the system. We've got an encryption strategy. We've got a tokenization, minimization strategy. That's way beyond what we could do inside of here. But let's just say for right now in the data architecture, we're talking about owners, we're talking about sensitivity, and we're talking about certain types of data. And for right now, we're going to say that the data is stored either in block storage or their virtual machines, and we're not going to make it anything else other than this, except for images. We're going to have a different set of images. We're going to have a different data center architecture. We're going to have our imaging server. This is typically called the PAC system. And we're going to be using the local hard drives on it, the local SSD storage for normal stuff. And that means images that we may see in the next month. When we're done that, what we're typically going to do is we're going to put it in file storage for about 6 months. And we typically keep that there for about 6 months because we typically might need it a lot. And then typically when we're done with this kind of data, we typically back it up to object storage. And we keep 7 years because that's required by law for the industry we're in. Let's just say it's 7 years. That's our data architecture. So where have we come so far? We did the phase A, which is the business architecture. We are the phase A. Where are we going? We went to phase B and we looked at the business capabilities that we mapped out a few. We mapped out the org chart. We mapped out some business processes. We then looked at the application architecture, and then we actually looked at the data architecture, for example. Now, let's kind of bring it down a little bit. So now let's actually talk about the devices themselves. So now let's design the technology architecture for this. Make sure I'm in the right spot. Something just disappeared from my screen. Okay. So now let's design the technology architecture.
Mike, can you share your screen?
Yep. As soon as I'm ready to do so in a second. Okay. So now we're going to design the technology architecture. And what I want everybody to see from the technology perspective, this is the infrastructure. So most clinical applications themselves run on virtual machines, almost all of them. So we're going to keep that in the back of our mind. And what we're going to find is that, from a technology infrastructure perspective, that the EHR, for example, the electronic health records, actually, let's start with the top. We'll start with the registration. Registration needs 5 virtual machines. The app needs 5 virtual machines. And as it turns out, these apps on standard, I'm just going to try to differentiate this from the exact solutions architecture. These are going to need 8 cores with 32 gigs of DRAM on a high performance modern CPU. And because we're keeping it real simple here, the scheduling exam is the same thing. The triage exam is the same thing. Didn't mean to do that. The electronic health records.
5 virtual machines, 8 cores, 32 gigs of DRAM. Lab systems. There's a reason we're working through this. Referral app. I think we need a billing app. I think that's about the apps we're going to use here. Now, from a technology perspective, here's what I really want you to see. This is generic as can be. We know we need 5 virtual machines with a modern high-performance CPU core, like the newest Intel or AMD EPYC thing. And we know what we need there. Now, what we also will realistically need from a technology architecture is we will need a firewall. We will need 2 firewalls, next generation firewalls. And we will need at minimum 3 enterprise layer 3 switches, unless we go to the cloud. So that's going to be the technology platforms we need. Now, at this point, I have no preference of any of the technology whatsoever. And I want you to understand that if you're a great architect, when we know we need a virtual machine with 5 or with 8 of the most modern cores, I don't want you to, in your mind, have a solution figured out. And I'm going to show you why. We're going to work through this. Right now, all I'm thinking is these are the capabilities, these are the apps, this is the data structure I need, and this is what that business needs to be successful. So that is your focus as an architect. Now, we're going to go step down. Because right now, what we really have is a business architecture, an application architecture, a technology architecture. We know where we're going. But what kind of stuff are we going to use? So here's where I want you to all help me, because this is where we can have lots of solutions architectures. So we need a virtual machine that has 8 modern AMD 5th generation EPYC cores, because they're right now the fastest CPUs in the world, and each core is the fastest. So if we're going to build it from scratch, we don't want to use a sloppy old CPU, or if we're going to buy a new server or we're going to use something, let's use the good stuff that'll give us many years of growth, especially because the cost of these is relatively inexpensive. So what we ultimately need is, let's go back and look at this architecture together. We need so we need 40 cores here, 40, 80, 120, 160. Wait, hold on. So 40, 80, 120, 160, 200, 240, 280, 320, 360, 400, 440 cores is what we need. Total 440 cores. And we also need 32 gigs of DRAM multiplied times all of these systems. So let's calculate our total DRAM, so we can look at this intelligently without actually having any pre-made biases ahead of time. So in total DRAM, we need, so 32 times 5 equals 160 gigs per each one of these clusters. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4 times 11. So we need 1.76 terabytes of DRAM. Not that much. So 440 cores and total, so 1760 GB DRAM.
All right. So this is where we start leveraging our business acumen when we start thinking, what kind of technology are we going to use to host it? So, okay, and you all go out there and everybody find me something that uses AMD 5th generation EPYC CPUs on the AWS cloud that gives me 8 cores and 32 gigs of DRAM. And drop it off in the chat box. I'll show you what I actually picked this morning for that. And because that could be used as our base virtual machine. I'm also going to use AI and do a quick search. I'm going to see what it's going to cost for me to go to Dell and me to buy these servers so we can compare the costs. Because at the end of the day, I have no bias as an architect where I host my system. I choose the system that's best for my clients. So let's walk through this. And so a good AWS EC2 instance that we could use in this solutions architecture would be an M8A.2x large. Now, realistically speaking, if we assume that each system gets a 1 terabyte hard drive with 200K IOPS, because that's what we're going to get in the data center. We're going to spec it out for the same thing in the cloud, even though we don't need that kind of performance, just to do an apples to apples cost comparison. If we were going to make it cloud optimized, we would cut down the performance dramatically and not get what we had in the data center to cost optimize it. But we're just going to look at it conceptually. So realistically speaking, this compute workload, assuming I don't run it in a redundant capacity in AWS, is going to be approximately $482,000 a month on EBS volumes, and it's going to be approximately $21,000 a month in compute. So if we actually do some backups on there, and we have, say, 300 terabytes of backups from our PAC systems, that's going to be another $6,000 a month. So if we host this on the cloud, what we're going to be dealing with is about $500,000 plus a month on any cloud provider to actually host those. Now, let's assume we decide we're going to build it ourselves. So we go to Dell and we buy some Dell PowerEdge R7725 XD servers. These hold the newest, most powerful 5th generation servers. And inside of these servers, we decide to buy 3 of them. And each one of these servers has 256 physical cores, which means 512 virtual cores, which is more than we needed for any of our entire compute, all on a single server. But we're going to buy 3 in case one fails. And to buy those 3 servers with 256 cores and about 2 terabytes of DRAM, to buy 3 of them, we're dealing with about $400,000, $450,000 just for the servers. Now, we need about another $150,000 to $200,000 of routers and switches and firewalls. So we're dealing with approximately $600,000 one time, or approximately $500,000 a month in the cloud. Now, of course, if we understand business, we realize that for $500,000, we can lease that or we can finance that and drop that cost as something that's a fraction of what we're paying in the cloud. Now, obviously, the trade-off is we have to operate it. We have to have the proper people that know how to maintain it. So nothing comes free, and we always have to evaluate these trade-offs. So let's just say in our solutions architecture, we're going to self-host it. So we will choose that because it's going to be cheaper in this option. And besides, if we don't have to connect to something far away, we don't have to worry about the systems going down if the wide area network was going down, and we don't have to pay for a wide area network. So this is going to be easier. So we're just going to pick this. So now let's kind of look at what that architecture might look like. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get into that solutions architecture. And in the solutions architecture, we're going to, let's see what we need.
Mike, are you sharing?
Sure. Thank you. So let's say, and it's going to be a basic solutions architecture because we're doing this live on the fly, but let's kind of look at what we're going to need. We're going to need backup for these systems. So let's find 2 Synology type NAS systems. We'll find those backup. Let's see what we can use. So we can get 4 of these. Hold on. Let me just pop off. So what we're going to do, because we know we're going to have about 300 gigs of images, we're going to buy 4 of these Synology NAS rack mount servers. And realistically speaking, they're about 40K total. And we only need 2 of them, but we're buying 4 of them for redundancy purposes. So we've got extra. At the same time, we're going to buy 3 of these Dell. Oops, where's this? I don't know what happened there. Bear with me. Where'd that go? We're going to buy 3 Dell Power Edge R77725 XD, 2 TB DRAM, 10 times 8 terabyte NVMe in RAID 6. For speed and redundancy, we need 3 Cisco 8300s switches. We need 2 next generation Cisco firewalls. And that's basically the infrastructure solutions architecture. Now, let's go back to the applications, and we're going to change them to the solutions architecture. So in this case, it'll be the application solutions architecture. And in this solutions architecture, the registration app, well, and the registration app will be Nix registration. And the scheduling app will be FE scheduling. The triage app will be Maria's triage. The discharge app will be Peter's. The electronic health record will be Angelo's EHR. These are the brands. The lab app will be the Anastasia lab app. We will have Vigeli's imaging. And you know what? Cindy has a friend on the other end of the wire. We will have Sunny's referral. We'll have Lisa's billing app. And we will have Cisco NGFW model Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta Exo Foxtrot 1 2 3. And then we will have 3 enterprise Cisco. These will be Cisco Papa Oscar Uniform Tango 1 2 3. So we made them up. And that's realistically speaking your solutions architecture. Your solutions architecture goes down to that bill of materials level. So now we know, basically speaking, what we're trying to achieve. That's the business vision. We mapped out the business architecture and what we're trying to achieve. Then we mapped out the application architecture and data architecture. Then we mapped out the technology architecture. Then we created the solutions architecture. Now, realistically speaking, we'll present this back to the client, get the feedback, whatever. Now, at this point, if we're following TOGAF, what's next? Well, we've got to build the migration plan. So we'll build a migration plan for this kind of thing. We'll make it real simple. We'll make it only about the tech, but let's just build a migration plan so we can do it in real time. Now, the migration plan is going to be this. Let's build our text box. The migration will take 3 months once the facility is built. Phase 1, install LAN infrastructure. Phase 2, install compute infrastructure. Phase 3, install the virtualization like VMware or Nutanix or OpenStack. Install cloud software.
Mike, are you sharing screen?
I guess not. Boy, this is, thank you, Chris. So realistically speaking, this is something like, you know, what the plan might be. Then it might be, well, we'll phase 5, install apps. Phase 6, testing apps. Phase 7 is user training. And whatever it takes. Now, a part of this plan will be we need 5 engineers, 3 network engineers, 3 security engineers, 5 sysadmins, 5 cloud Linux engineers. Meaning like the kind of people that know how to install Linux clouds, troubleshoot Linux clouds, and do any other kind of heavy duty Linux work we need. So I'm just going to say Linux engineers. And that's a basic migration plan. I mean, it's quick and we're there. So what's next? So now that we know where we're going, now that we know what's going to support it, now that we've got the technology, we need a governance structure. So we need someone that's going to govern the implementation. Who's going to support it? We're going to need to create a structure for when a change needs to occur. Who's going to review it? We need to create a structure that when Sally in security says we need to change this, the rest of the team can understand the impacts of those changes to the organization. So what do we need to do? We need to do a few things. We need to create an enterprise architecture review board. And in this review board, we've got the executive sponsor, which is often the C-suite that brought you in. And then we've got a chair of the review board. And that review board will have all the architects that we need. Enterprise architects, security architects, data architects, people from the business side. And that way, when you have an architectural change, you'll be able to assess the impact on your business for an architecture. Now, we're going to implement an architecture. It's going to create changes, right? You know, we're not going to add a new application. We're not going to change the way people do their work. without creating the cultural change with it. We're going to have to get our sponsors on board. We're going to have to make sure we create training and collateral organization. We're going to have to create that change control board. So we're typically going to create another change management review board. Now, you know me, I love cats, so I use cats for everything. But again, where we're going to have that, it's going to look similar to the architecture review board. But in this case, instead of having architects in every position, we're going to have different people from the business, people that'll be in charge of training, people that'll be there to make sure people that are adopting it are doing well and calculating metrics on it, people from the business units that are going to want to show it to others, people from HR that are going to try to convince you to use it. And that's kind of the standard thing. So if you really, really walk through it, you know, in that TOGAF 10 that we quickly did, you know, let's go through it. The preliminary phase is just setting up an architecture capability for the organization. I want to do that here. We define the vision in phase A. What are we trying to achieve? In phase B, we define the business architecture. In phase C, we define the data and the applications architectures. In phase D, we design the technology architecture. In phase D, we came up with the solutions architecture. They call it identify solutions. And then in phase right after that, we create the migration roadmap. How do we go from where we're at to where we want to go? We then figure out any kind of governance and structure we need along the way. And then we figure out a way to make changes occur smoothly across the organization. And that's TOGAF in a nutshell. That's documented with a little bit of cats. If you like my TOGAF cap explanation, let me know, TOGAF. Let me know that you did. I just like cats everywhere. Sometimes it lightens the mood. So the project, so let's say I saw a couple of questions come in. Let me finish on these questions, and then I will finish for the day.
Mike, where are you looking?
I might not look. Oh, must be looking at the wrong window. Hold on. Oh, yep. Okay, thank you. Okay, so one more question using Agile. Can Agile be used for the architectural development method? Anything that you want to use as a framework to make sure you do it the same way every time is fine to use. The reality is in nearly every organization that you will work for, they will have their own architecture framework. Now, most organizations, if they use a framework, they tend to use TOGAF about 80%, which is why I like to teach that one. But for the most part, anybody that actually has an efficient architecture practice doesn't use all of TOGAF. They don't use all of Zachman. They don't use all of any framework. What they do is they take the structure out of it, they minimize it down to exactly what's best for their organization, and they use it. So you could use any kind of framework that you want to use. And yes, Agile could work too. The real thing that really matters is to make sure that whatever the business goals are is the same way the people are going and the same way the technology going. If they're all focused on the same thing, you have architecture success. If you've got tech people going in one direction and business people going in another direction, which is what happens at most companies without great enterprise architecture, they spend lots of money on technology, but it doesn't do anything for them because it's not helping the people with their needs. Great question. When is it right to lease or finance software for an architecture, or just give you an example when to lease or buy? When it makes financial sense. So let's look at your multiple options here. So if I have the opportunity to pay $500,000 one time or $5,000 a month, and in many cases you can, I'll give you an example. We have a cloud that exists of 10 servers, and each server has two Xeon E5 26 like 80 something V3s or V4s. They all have 24 cores. They all have 128 gigs of RAM, and they all have a bunch of 1 terabyte NVMe drives. Now, I bought those servers for approximately $1,000. I bought 10 of them directly from Amazon. Now, to rent them, they were i3 instances that were about $1,000 a month to rent the entire server. I bought the whole server for $1,000, but it was $1,000 a month to rent. So I was able to spend 10 grand on them, or 10 grand a month. Now, over 4 years that my students have used these servers, even though I bought them refurbished, if it was 10 grand a month, that would have been $480,000 versus the $10,000 I spent for the servers. So which made a better lab for my students? Buying the servers in the first space. Now, it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes you need something that's very agile that you need to spin up and go close. Another thing that I was talking about is I'm talking about compute heavy. Many workloads are not compute heavy, and those workloads are cheaper to run, say, on a cloud. So here's what influences a business decisions. If they need to plan investment for something else, well, if they need a lot of cash, they may hold on to it. Now, if they need to hold on to their cash, well, they could rent it on the cloud, or they could buy it with a finance, or they can finance it with lease. So if I've got a company and the company has no debt on the balance sheet, my $500,000 of servers, realistically speaking, I could get down, realistically speaking, to about $150,000 a year on a 4-year finance. Now, $150,000 a year is about $12,500 a month compared to the $500,000 a month on the cloud provider. It's a lot cheaper, but there's a big thing. One is debt on the balance sheet. And if an organization has debt on the balance sheet and they're trying to enhance their multiples and others, that may not be a good thing or a bad thing based upon what it is. That organization, if they don't want debt on the balance sheet, they may choose to lease it. And if they lease it, instead of paying about $500,000 a month, and instead of financing for, say, $12,500, they might be able to lease it for $11,000 or $10,000. But if they lease it, it gets classified as an operational expense, so it won't be seen on their balance sheet. So these are the kind of factors that go into it. It's an organization's capital structure, how they want their money to be seen. And that's why I train business acumen in any of the architects I train, because you're going to have to be aware of those decisions to help them make the business make a better decision. It's based on finance. It's just like a doctor that writes a prescription. When I write a prescription to see a patient, the patient comes in, I determine what their condition is. I don't say I'm going to write this Pfizer prescription or Merck prescription. I determine what their condition is, then I write a treatment plan. Same thing as an architect. I don't care if it belongs on Cisco or Microsoft or AWS. I care that it solves my customer problem. So finance, vendor relationship, quality of support, it's all good. And I'm not saying the cloud architectures don't make sense. I'm saying in this case, it probably made sense to do it locally in the office. In other cases, the cloud architecture will be much cheaper. It's all just mapping out what we need and the level of what we need and where we need it, how we need it, and why we need it. Great questions. Is a migration plan the same as an implementation plan? No. A migration plan is, what's it going to take? Who do we need? How many people? What are the main phases? An implementation plan is a project plan, which is made by a project manager that will list every step along the critical path from point A to point B, everything that has to occur. So that is going to be a tremendously detailed plan. As a rule, architecture is strategy. Strategy plays higher layer. We architects focus on big, higher level decisions. Should we build it? Should we not build it, for example? And the engineers focus on tuning all these details of what could be built. So that engineer will figure out if it's BGP, how they're going to manipulate traffic. Are they going to prepend something? Are they going to, like an AS path, they're going to change the weight, change the local preference? Those engineers are going to dial deep. And the engineers dial deep on the building thing. The project managers dial deep on the exact set of steps that get things done. Architects are strategists, either building a plan, a migration plan at the strategy level, a technology plan at the strategy level. So no, they're not the same. But it's a great question. Based on the previous slide, is my migration plan execution part similar or different to a change management plan? It's actually different. So if I have a change management plan, I have to think about what's necessary to change. So I'll give you probably the best example of change management that I've ever heard. And I think it occurred it was either in the country of Switzerland or Sweden. I think it was Sweden. And what happened is they used to drive on the left side of the road, and they were going to make everybody drive on the right side of the road. So imagine you've got an entire country that's used to driving on one side of the road, and then all of a sudden, the next day, they're going to be driving on the other side of the road. So if you tried to say today
Tomorrow, everybody in England drives on the American side of the road, and everybody in America drives on the English side of the road. What we would have is mass chaos. So in order to be able to change the side of the road people would drive on, and that's basically an architectural initiative, what we'd have to do is a year or 2 years ahead of time, we'd have to start having the news talk about moving. Then the governments would have to start using social media to start pushing it out. Then they would be coming to the schools to talk to the kids who don't drive to remind the parents they're driving. Then there'd be Facebook ads and Instagram ads and YouTube ads coming out everywhere. Then there'd be street signs everywhere. Don't forget, we're driving on the opposite side of the road. Then they'd have police probably directing traffic. So that's what it takes to change a big thing like a country or an enterprise. So the change management plan is going to be every step that it takes. Who do you need to speak to? Exactly who's doing what? Who's your champions? Who's your supporters? Who's part of your influence strategy? Who's doing the training? That's more of a difference. So it's similar. So all these things are plans, but each plan ultimately is planning to do a different goal, and therefore each plan tends to get a little different. Now, in the end of the day, we are right. They're all trying to get the people, processes, and the organization adapted to the new environment, like you said, but lots and lots and lots of plans. Great question. Chris, we can go to the next one. At one point, does this enterprise architectural initiative migration become a formal project that can follow the organization's project plans management structure? So realistically speaking, if we really walk through now, here's the way I summarize my enterprise architecture process. So, many people ask me about TOGAF, and I said, tune it to what you really do. So here's my tuned version of an architecture, because this is the way I look at it. So, and I'll tell you where I get different levels of projects and commitment. So getting rid of the TOGAF layers, the first part is to figure out where you're going. Looks a whole lot like TOGAF Phase A, right? Because it is. Once we know where we're going, that next piece over here is to figure out really, really, really what's going on with the org chart, who those business processes are. So Phase B. Now, to me, I'm going to look at the data architecture, the application architecture, and the technology architecture all at the same time with my teams. My application architects are going to be looking at applications. My data architects and AI architects are looking at the data. And my cloud architects, network architects, security architects, they're all going to be looking at the technology. So I'm going to do all this at the same time. And what we're going to do is we're going to figure out what they have, and we're going to come back to what they need. Now, at this point, we think we have it right, but the reality is we probably don't. So after we work with our team, we're going to go back to these stakeholders and get their perspective. And they're going to say, Mike, you got 8 out of 10 of these, but you got to tune this one. We're going to tune the 8th one or the 9th one out of the 10, and it's going to break something in the business. And that's why we have to go back to the stakeholders. So we'll go back and forth for about 6 months to try to finalize this. Now, at this point, what we're going to do is we're going to get soft architectural commitment, in that we're going to make sure that the stakeholders are going to agree to it, assuming we get everything dialed in and exact. And then what we're going to do is we're going to start calling our vendors. Our vendors are going to create a solutions architecture with us. We're going to then go back to our teams and evaluate it for whether it's going to work. We're going to pick the best solutions architecture we like. And we're going to go back to these stakeholders. We're going to get their support. We're going to get their buy-in. We're going to be involved in a lot of vendor meetings here, negotiations back and forth with the vendors, and the such is going to go on here. At the same time, we are working on planning the migration. The vendors are planning the migration and whatever professional services and implementation needs to be there. Hopefully, we're working on this here. And once all that stuff's done, that's where we're going to sign our architectural contracts, where they're going to buy whatever they're going to buy from Cisco, IBM, would actually have you. And that's when you got your official project kickoff, once your architectural contracts are signed. But that's typically the flow. But
this can change. It doesn't have to necessarily follow the exact order, but that's typically the order that it follows. So if the question is, when does the project actually start? You're always, and when do you start working with project managers? You're always going to. Because let's say the client issue, let's say you're the client or you're working at an end customer. And let's say you're working at Cisco as a consulting enterprise architect. You're going to provide some consulting and you're going to be working with their project managers the whole time. And the organization themselves is going to be working with the project managers. So this is a team. You're going to always be working with project managers. You're going to always be working with business leaders. You're going to be working with solutions architects who are going to dive deep on the tech. You're going to work with platform architects that are going to focus on the platform. We'll even have some engineers on our team to focus on the heavy duty engineering so we don't miss anything, especially the solutions architects will. Hope that helps, Darnell. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. So if you're having a good time, give it a like. Subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell to be notified of new videos to help you in your architecture career. And tell a friend about our channel. Tomorrow, we're going to have a webinar on how to become a security architect. But every week, we run 2 webinars. One is on Thursday. One is on Monday on how to become any kind of architect. Tomorrow is going to be on security, but I'll answer any questions you have about enterprise architecture careers, cloud architecture careers, or any other architecture career for that matter. So hope to see you there. And please sign up for the book. We're going to be releasing the book that goes along with this course on the last day of this class. So sign up. My team will drop that link in the chat box. Thank you all. It was so nice to see you, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Or for those of you that are my students, I look forward to seeing you in class. Take care, everyone.